Odd.
Don't say Todd.
Odd.
No.
Todd.
Hi guys, this is the Big Boys Table 12, by the way. I'm
By
with
the way.
IskatuMesk, by the way.
By the way.
Today we're going to be talking about world building, making your own setting, all that good stuff in the confines of a video game. And to illustrate this point, I had a thought that was from Mesk, actually. Mesk transplanted a thought into my head. It was a scary procedure, but I survived to tell the tale. And that thought was that most people who are making mods don't end up creating an entirely new setting in which to tell a story. And I guess most people in games, in the context of games, probably don't really seek to tell much of a story to begin with, or if it is like a priority, most of the time people don't look at it like, oh, this should be. Unfortunately, people who do look at it as a priority seem to look at it as if it's okay to then ignore the game aspect of their game and just make it about the story. So they usually sacrifice one for the other instead of trying to intertwine them. But what I see happen a lot with people who are modding, at the very least for custom content, they tend to stay within the same universe instead of trying to create their own. And even when they do occasionally try to create their own, it's usually like copy pasted in many aspects from the original setting. I guess as a good example of that, as a good example of that, there's a Warcraft 3 campaign series called Legends of Arcane, and they have humans and orcs and elves and all this other stuff. They have basically everything from Warcraft 3, but it's not Warcraft 3. It's not Azeroth. It's Arcane. So that's like the extent of my knowledge with it. There's undead and everything in there as well, but it looks like just a couple of proper nouns are different, and that seems to be the only changes.
That's all Metzen does is just change one or two letters and copy paste from everyone else.
Right, so it's something that you'll see in a lot of AAA titles, released products, as well as custom content. But we can start in the custom content scene since it's a bit more familiar with everybody, and a lot of people watching have actually made content or are interested in making content, so we can talk about it from that perspective. I guess the easy question to answer would be why people tend to gravitate towards staying within the setting of their own game that they're modding. It's easy and readily available content. Most people who play the mods are familiar with the source material, etc., etc. But when it comes to just trying to tell a story, why do you think a lot of people want to tell the stories inside existing IPs as opposed to their own settings?
They're too scared to get into writing.
You think it's really that simple?
That's really it. I have talked to so many people, not just in StarCraft, but just everywhere. And let me think. There's one guy who made something heavily derivative and then rewrote it a billion times afterwards. There's not really a lot comes to mind. Most people don't like making stuff. I actually had a rather extensive discussion with somebody in regards to making D&D games as a DM and on the process of world building and stuff like that, which it's kind of really similar, actually. It's just you have a lot more power in it than you do in, say, StarCraft. In StarCraft, you can only portray so much, so you got to kind of put baby wheels on everything you throw into it. But a lot of people just actually are super scared of getting into it. A lot of people, they see the process of being creative, of building characters and worlds and setting and stuff like that, and they walk in and they want to make a project of some kind, but they think of themselves, many of them literally say in their own words, I don't know how to write, I don't know how to make a world, I don't even know where to begin, and they just don't. And inevitably, this ends up destroying them and their project. See, for example, Laconius. I think one of the main issues he had was trying to stick to StarCraft's writing, is evidently his writing style and everything he injected into it was very, very different. And that's also an issue with, I would say, every single StarCraft campaign that I am at least somewhat familiar with is, I mean, StarCraft in itself is a huge mess, but when you throw things on top of it, it becomes even more huge of a mess. And Warcraft and anything like that is the same way, because when people decide to make a campaign with gameplay and they try to inject their characters and stuff into it, they kind of just throw in whatever is convenient at the moment. And something I'm probably going to be reiterating a lot anytime we discuss story and writing is simplicity is super critical, especially if you are unfamiliar and you don't need to worry about being original or whatever. Obviously, Blizzard et al. Do not. But presentation is the biggest thing. And a lot of people get hung up on the process of making a world. And it's a big subject to just dive into. Perhaps you have some point you would like to start off on.
Yeah, sure. So my main inspiration for any sort of campaign that I try to make, since I have been making campaigns for a while, even though I've only released one, and it has been to tell a story that does the premise of StarCraft better justice than Blizzard. So I'm very much not, I guess, with the body of work that I've created, I'm in the opposite sort of, what's the term? I'm in the opposite camp. I don't necessarily think there's anything super wrong with not telling your own story. But I do recognize that a lot of people don't seem to actually go as far as they should when telling their own story. A lot of people try to work around the lore. A lot of people try to, not write anything that would be at odds with the source material. And this is true for, regardless of the actual source material in question, StarCraft, Warcraft, something completely different. If they're modding something, if they're making content for a particular platform that isn't their own original idea, they'll usually want to be pretty faithful to it, it seems. And you'll occasionally get really weird stuff that isn't faithful, but usually it's not very well developed either. Even if it's still it doesn't completely go against the canon, go against the grain, it's still usually not very well thought out and well founded to begin with, to the point of being useful. So it's something like that, I would say. When people are starting to get into world building, I will echo your point of simplicity being important, and this is true with basically anything that you're doing creatively or otherwise. If you don't know how to do the basics, to at least at some level of average competency, you don't want to try to reinvent the wheel or get cute with stuff and try to do really weird things. You may have really great aspirations, and I'm not saying that you'll never be able to get those aspirations, done as long-term goals or something, but you want to set realistic expectations for yourself at the same time, and you have to realize that there's going to be stumbling blocks and learning along the way, and it's not just going to be a 0 to 100 thing where you're instantly the best story writer ever, the best person who can make crazy characters that are really cool and intertwine all these different arcs and plot elements and MacGuffins and all this other stuff. You have to learn what each individual element of world building and story crafting and narrative structure actually refers to. And once you have basic definitions in place, you're able to list off examples, think about what inspires you from the media that you've consumed over the years and what you enjoy. That's where you can start to, I would say that's probably when you can start to experiment and try new things, but you should at least know what the basics are. And as far as analyzing stuff, I think that games are probably the worst thing to analyze if you're trying to learn the basics. What you should probably do, and what I've been doing, is look at films, look at novels, basic 3-act structures, and try to figure out how those are constructed, because they're really easy to get invested in. They're really easy to do well if your concept is just simple. The first Star Wars movie is pretty basic. It's not very crazy. For its time, it had some neat ideas, but at its core, it's very similar to the first Lord of the Rings film. And they're obviously very different genres, but if you look at their analyses, and this is a famous analysis that everybody's probably heard of if they've taken even a little bit of film course in high school or something, but you'll see Lord of the Rings and what else? Star Wars, they both have the same sort of act. They have the same mentor character. They have got the same coming of age story or whatever. And there's all this different stuff in them that matches up if you just storyboarded it out for whatever reason. And that's really weird, but also very, I think, important to note, because you'll see a lot of the same basic stuff used and echoed across projects, across products, across movies, films, etc. But games need gameplay. So you'll never really see a whole lot of gameplay coming out from a really narrative-driven experience. Usually you have these really long cutscenes at the beginning that introduce the story or something. And even with the Call of Duty games, they were like this. So it's not even uniquely about like stories that in games that most people like. I mean, Mass Effect was obviously a really big offender of telling instead of showing, even though they had a bunch of cutscenes, because they would just like exposit information to you, or you just read stuff in a manual somewhere. But when you have stuff like action-based games, even StarCraft to an extent, which wasn't quite action-based with its campaign, it left you like sort of out of nowhere. Like you didn't really have a single arc that you started in. It's not something you can trace back, and that's why I recommend looking at the initial stories that everybody brings up. Star Wars and Lord of the Rings first movie are really basic stuff at their core, and you can analyze them and bring them down in their smaller elements and figure out like what makes the characters work, what makes the setting work, what allows me to go into this fantastical setting that has very little to do with day-to-day life and still feel like I'm somewhat at home with these people. Like what allows me to do that? And usually it's something to do with like a character that's sort of an avatar for the audience, like Luke Skywalker, as he's like sort of learning all of this stuff where he's like a pretty average person, and then he learns all this stuff through the sage character, Obi-Wan, and you follow along with this stuff. But there's still so much that you don't see from games. You don't see a character like Luke Skywalker in the games, because the player's character is this viewport that doesn't have any dialogue, doesn't have any motivations, is just there for the sake of like showing the perspective of the story. And that's like a really big thing that hindered it across all of the campaigns. They always had a viewport character, and it was a really big hindrance to the narrative structure. And so you never had any development of the main character. And in fact, very few characters in StarCraft ever had development at all. Jim Raynor's one of the few, and his development wasn't really that marked in the first place. And just at the end of it, he hated Sarah Kerrigan, and at the beginning, as soon as he met her, he sort of liked her, and that was like the only change really in his character. Even though he lost friends and lost people and planets and stuff, like apparently his entire family, which is just glossed over in one dialogue event. Like, okay, so you don't really get a whole lot of characterization out of him. So I don't think games are really great for this sort of thing, and that's why I would recommend other people look at that. But as far as games go, and as far as storytelling and world building goes, like visual storytelling, explaining the setting without an overabundance of text or exposition, are there any games that you would recommend for people to like study the setting in and how it's characterized? Because like obviously Mass Effect is like an example of it done wrong, where everything is like told instead of shown. But is there anything that fits the opposite, in your opinion?
Let me think. What have I played that claimed to have good writing? Hold on, let me look at my list.
Oh, boy.
But while I'm loading up that list, I just wanted to say that the main thing that drives story is engagement, and engagement is tied to something called player feedback, and player feedback is tied to something called satisfaction. So when you get into a game, almost every single game you're going to run into has some kind of conflict. And maybe that conflict is, Raynor's libido. Maybe the conflict is some political showdown. Maybe the conflict is just, Devil May Cry, two brothers, etc. So when you want to build a world, you got to think about what is actually engaging me as a player to get involved in this world. That's usually why most books have some lazy ass blurb in the front they copy pasted from elsewhere in it that's a part of some action, as opposed to actually starting you off good and proper, which is having an immediate engagement and then giving you a reason to care about what's going on and then actually building off of that. So let's see, the games that I've played God of War, all that has terrible story. Dark Souls has no story. Let's see, DMC's writing is all right.
Well, even if the story isn't that great, can you think of like a world building or some sort of like immersion within the setting itself? Like people, you probably won't get this because I don't think you've watched any recent television shows, but Altered Carbon has a really interesting setting that is visually enticing and really nice to explore, and that's more interesting to me than the shoddy story they did with the characters. So, like, for other people might be able to look into that. I feel like the narrative that they went with, the story arc was really poor, but the setting itself was really interesting. So
settings that I got into, let's see, there's Transformers with Beast Wars, there's Reboot, there's Shadow Raiders, and then there is Fate, actually, which is Japanese. Transformers, of course, is Japanese as well. So
which Transformers?
Well, all the Transformers comes from the same one, but I'm primarily thinking of Beast Wars, which was actually created by, it might have even been created by Canadians, unbelievably. There was a studio, I believe they were called Mainframe Entertainment, and they were actually responsible for many of the classics that I would say today have endured. So the reason why I want to bring that up especially is because of the connotations that Blizzard produces writing that is at best similar to Saturday morning cartoons. Well, Saturday morning cartoons have always been several legs above Blizzard in terms of sophistication and in terms of production quality. Reboot and Beast Wars are probably the biggest ones that we call it. Yes, they were actually produced in about a company that was about an hour away from where I live, actually, in Vancouver. So they produced the first ever CGI to animated TV series, which was Reboots. And I imagine the vast majority of people who are playing with StarCraft 2 or making StarCraft 2 are far too young to know what Reboot is. But it basically is like, it was signature. If you're old enough to know what it is, and it is signature. Because, so in a nutshell, what Reboot is it follows some characters who live basically within a computer system. Everything in it is based in some manner off of computer technology or computer mechanisms. For example, games are like environment changing events, and there's like stuff in them that changes stuff, and a lot of the earlier stuff circulates around characters trying to defeat them because otherwise they like decimate the city or something like that. So there was like lots of neat stuff in that, and obviously if you look at it today, it's going to look pretty dated, but it was really significant. Another story, another world, storytelling thing that I would like to bring up before we get too deep into this, and one of the biggest inspirations that I had since I grew up off of it was The Shadow, and I know I've mentioned this before, The Shadow. So obviously, I live in like basically a third world country. It's Canada. It's disgusting. And when I was young, things were obviously even worse. So I really wasn't exposed to most of the like 80s and 90s and like I mean, I'm not really exposed to television and stuff at all. Reboot and Beast Wars are kind of like an exception, as well as Dragon Ball Z. But I've mostly lived off of building my own stuff, like writing tape deck shows, but also radio. So The Shadow is a radio show. I believe all the episodes, or many of the episodes, are available either on archive.org or elsewhere. Although when I tried to listen to them, the quality was so bad I couldn't understand what was going on most of the time anyways. But it was better when I used natural radio way back in the day. So The Shadow is pretty simple. It's basically a detective series. And the detective person has some ability to like be completely hidden in darkness or something like that. Unfortunately, I really do not remember a lot of details about it. But it was audio only. And of course, I had grown up using like tape decks and stuff like that. Like cable television was a colossal luxury. It was something that I just didn't have for most of my life. So radio and using a tape deck and making my own equivalents and stuff like that, they all kind of synergize into each other. That's why I grew up with writing. So a lot of what I'm going to say in regards to writing comes in part from that history and in part from learning to work with very little. Something else you're going to also see a lot with an anime, because anime typically is very budget constrained, and a lot of anime is going to be hit or miss, much like Western productions. I think that a lot of recent anime has been more miss than hit, but some of it is pretty decent, and I would like to discuss some examples as we go through this discussion, because I think they can be reflected on within custom content very, very readily. And minimalism, and using a little to tell a lot. So if you're thinking about making a campaign or thinking about making a mod or something equivalent, and you would like to get into a custom world and you really don't know how to get off of, I'd like to go back to where I was initially discussing, is focus on the conflict and focus on the presentation that engages the player. Because when the player is engaged by something that's going on right in front of them, that means skip the 10-15 minute introduction cinematic. Maybe have a few minutes of introduction just to get you acquainted with the character that you're representing and the conflict he's immediately in. So Apex threw you into the middle of Larry's laboratory In the written adaptation, I've had quite a few people tell me that's one of the best introductions for anything they have ever read, even though my writing skills are they're bad. So whether or not it was just people sucking up or not, what stands is that it just throws you immediately into the conflict. It gets you right into the action and the character thinking, and the character thinking tells a lot about how the character is going on. Well, within a build and destroy campaign, by extent of you being the player character and winning a lot of missions, because that's how you progress the story, is by being successful in missions, then that is what starts echoing out real world impact and where people start to notice. And of course, because the difficulty of the campaign was very high, that as well is very much factored into the story. As opposed to, say, for example, World of Warcraft or Diablo 3, where all these big bads are talked up and you basically just step all over them. So it's it has many facets, world building, but initially definitely starting off focused on the engagement. And when you look at TV series, the problem with a TV series that's going to really set you apart from most mods is the episodic nature. So you mentioned the 3 points plot progression: the beginning, the trial, and then the climax. So that is a Western standard that has been followed to the T for as long as you can remember. 3 is a number that has power basically everywhere you go. The thing is based on 3 for that exact same structure. And there's a reason why everybody uses it, because it's simple and easy to follow. And it's very psychological. So when you're comfortable with having the player within this world, you will give birth to pizza.
Okay, I think we're back. So, you were just finishing up your point about the difference between TV shows and the typical 3-act or 3-point structure for novels, and how 3 points are just like a symbol of power somehow in the West specifically, or just everywhere.
I'm guessing you just missed everything I said.
So, no, I heard it, but I don't know if the stream did, so I'm just having you repeat the last bit of the point is where we started dropping off.
If you've ever played an MMO, or really just any game with quest objectives, you notice they always are 3, especially in the West. Recently, Japan took it up as well. 3 is everywhere. 3 is, the beginning, the trial, the climax. There's a 3-point stand. There's a 3-point plot progression. There's 3-point objectives. Things that are thinly veiled as 3. They try not to be 3, but they amount to 3. Anyways, 3 is everywhere because it's simple, easy to follow, and people are extremely uncreative. Well, I would recommend most people focus on starting their campaign within a second stage of 3, which is you're already in the trial. You can worry about setting the stage for that trial later on. Maybe you can go back and make an earlier mission or something like that. But I would focus on having your initial concept when you're designing it in that conflict. You would have it within that second stage. You're already in the trial. So like I was mentioning with Apex. So Apex has a long-winded beginning to try to capture beginning within a campaign. You'd be probably sitting there for about 10 or 20 hours worth of cinematics. And that's not even exaggerating. There's just too much to begin. So it's much easier just to throw your rights into the trial in something very isolated, very linear, very specific, very easy to identify with, in that the player character wakes up, doesn't know what's going on, and you go from there. And then the pieces come in as you go along, bringing you both the initial and the conclusion, or at least the advancement to what will eventually become the conclusion. You can't do the 3-stage in a campaign because a campaign is a series of missions. But each mission is, in many cases, especially Blizzard's, broken down into 3 stages anyways, which makes them predictable and uninteresting. So you really want to throw that away when it comes to the actual gameplay design. You mostly want to focus on the trial aspect. Once you have a trial that you like, something that really engages you as a player, then you can worry about what actually created that trial. Because as you're probably going to find when you start getting into world building and designing stuff, is you're probably going to do a lot of planning, and you're going to end up throwing a lot of that planning out. Some people aren't like that, but the vast majority of them are. A lot of people may recommend you, and a lot of academic courses may recommend you to try to plan everything out ahead of time. Don't do that. It's a waste, especially when you're just starting off. Just stick your dick into the meat grinder and start spinning, because you're going to come up with way better results way faster than if you spent forever stressing over details that aren't even manifest in an actual project yet. Just get into making it, get into brainstorming it, throw shit together. Don't worry if it really makes sense or not. Just don't stick with the stuff that doesn't make sense like Blizzard did. You have the luxury of time, so you can take that time to really fill yourself out and see where your strengths are. My weakness, for example, is descriptive storytelling, and I hate narratives with an absolute passion, which is a pain because the vast majority of radio play stuff and audiobooks are narratives. And Retribution couldn't be done entirely in first person because it relied heavily on visuals. So I had to adapt it to a narrative, and I hated it every step of the way, and I would never do it again if I could avoid it. So, that's a weakness that I try to work around. And writing right campaigns can be hard, so you got to keep it super simple. And that's why I say if you're looking at it from the 3 stages of trial, climax, or trial, beginning, trial, and climax, English is just, it just doesn't fucking work for me. Then focus on the trial part first, because it's the easiest to get into. For example, Terran versus Zerg, everybody understands that. Zerg want to eat people, Terrans want to destroy them. It's just Warhammer. So don't bother over-complicating it with the Naga and the Dark Elves, or Dark Eldar, and the normal Eldar and the Necrons and all the other shit that they yanked in for StarCraft 2 and its hideous conglomeration of horse shit.
So what I want to ask you about is, you mentioned starting out in the trial, and I think that there's merit to that idea. I also think, though, that mission briefings in Brood War and just opening cutscenes can be the only beginning a mission or a campaign overall needs. Like, I think you can look at an individual mission and dice it up, like you said, into 3 acts as well. But I think the opening, the introduction, all the introduction and a gameplay mission should need is that opening cutscene that sets the stage, or that mission briefing that sets the stage. And I think aside from that,
most of them actually done via gameplay anyway. So
right. So I think that you can also immerse people in the world and do world building and that sort of thing just by having the characters react a certain way to whatever information is there, because your characters are going to be like like bouncing off from the player's perspective. The player's going to interpret something that's crazy maybe, but if the characters are just like carrying on like it's any old thing, that sends a signal to the player that this is like a standard sort of thing for this particular sorry, hold on, I'm getting Jode. So
getting Jode?
Yeah, it's like a new meme or something. So I think that in general, you have something like the first setup with the briefing, and then you have, or the opening cutscene to the game or something like that, and then after that you have, you get into the point where you're actually playing the game, and then there's like a dialogue event that occurs that doesn't interrupt gameplay. It's just there with like people talking between each other. And that's great. And then you have some world building. Some event occurs. Somebody says something completely outlandish, and the character responds in kind, or the character responds without like just taking it in stride, not seeming to care too much. And that thing that the player would assume is outlandish is now established as like commonplace in the setting. So it's like a very simple way you can do something like that. You could do the opposite, where something that you would think is pretty trivial or pretty tame is interpreted as like the worst thing ever, or something completely outlandish, and that you can do it any which way you want to do it. But I think crucially, starting out with gameplay as soon as possible, having very little in between the player selecting the level and the player starting to play, is like the easiest way to get the player immersed, because they have to act, they have to interact with the game very early on, and that's just going to breed immersion out of the player in the first place. And from there on, you have you can have the very, very early opening briefing, whatever, and at most I think you should be like very, very judicial with everything. You should cut stuff that doesn't need to be there. You should make sure that everything is delivered as quickly as possible, and you can worry about refining all this once you, like you so aptly described, sticking your dick into the meat grinder. Once you actually get your base elements there, you can start chopping them up and start deciding, what do I want to keep, what do I want to leave. Holy shit, I can't speak either. All right, so now it's your turn. So what I'm going to pitch to you as a question is, aside from this whole discussion about the second or the trial being where you start, the conflict being where you start in the mission, which I definitely agree with. You shouldn't be controlling gameplay where you're just moving characters around as they exposit information or explain the setup. You have them immediately interacting with the world and the characters and the game in a way that is due to a conflict, is involving a conflict. There's always action while the player's doing stuff. You should have that, but what I want to ask you is why you have a dislike for narratives, or I guess just define a narrative for me and then tell me what you don't like about it.
A narrative is just exposition. So within Retribution, which was the final audiobook, about 70-80% of it is past tense, which is not good for something that is not read. I feel like it's, unless you're actually reading an audiobook, a spoken representation of something that's already written, it should be avoided when possible because it's difficult to engage. And especially in a narrative, it creates a distance. I think in some cases it can be done, but in most, it can't be done. It's easier to do than a first-person perspective in current time, but it also comes off as really lazy. You lose a lot of energy. So a comparison would be the first-person sections of Retribution, for example, the execution sequence, the Anishim conversation, stuff like that. Those are all first-person. But the vast majority of it, including the beginning and towards of it, the end, is in largely past tense. And that means that it is a voice reciting things that have happened. And I tried to use music and sound effects and other stuff to give grounding to that. But to me, it always seemed to kind of distance itself from the concept of immersion. Because immersion means a vested interest. It means you're absorbed into it. And something that is in past tense has a connotation that it's already been resolved to whatever end. And that, to me, loses a lot of the charm that is possible to obtain in present tense. For example, within a motion picture, is typically those are very often done. Even when there's a narrative speaking, usually the visuals are in present tense. With major exceptions being, for example, when Harry Potter uses the memory thing in Harry Potter. Yeah. So those usually are like very, very specific and key events that are experienced as if they were in first person, because that's how that device works. So that device manages to sidestep the awkwardness of narrating things to Harry by having him experience them in first person. And then it opens up a whole whack of things by suddenly engaging him, and by extent the viewer or the reader, in what is actually going on, even though he is just living a memory. To that extent, I recapture that, or at least attempt to, with an apex within the various memory sequences that the main character goes through within segment 0. They're all experienced as if they were in real time. And obviously, when you're walking into a campaign and it's something that you're playing, even if you're doing it from the extent of it being a memory, it's usually you're controlling units. So you have influence, or should have influence, on how the mission and stuff is actually resolved. If you don't have influence on it, aka if you're playing a QTE or something similar, then you're not actually playing a game to begin with, and it doesn't matter what kind of story is going on, there's no actual player engagement whatsoever. And this is also something that I would like to add makes difficulty very important. Because having difficult gameplay that forces the player to actually pay attention and work for the reward of advancing the story and accomplishing the objectives set out by the plot will make them all the more invested in what they're actually fighting for.
Yes, I agree 100%. That's exactly what I set out to do when I make really challenging missions, which is all the time now. And like, I want every mission to be as challenging as the narrative should be. And I think I described this in a previous podcast, but you know, the player is suffering those challenges, bearing the brunt of those challenges, just like the characters involved are. So you're sort of connecting with them on a more important level than you would otherwise. So like an example is that I can think of off the top of my head is in the first mission of my campaign. There's a very, very brief microsection where you discover one of the main characters, and currently it's pretty clunky the way it's introduced. I'm rewriting it now, but the takeaway is you have to work pretty hard to keep all of your units alive, and if you succeed, well, the idea is that it's going to make later sections better. But then there's a bit of a twist where those units that you kept alive get destroyed by a lurker trap, like a hold position lurker trap or something, and your hard work is basically shot down right there. And the idea was to have some sort of emotional connection or some sort of investment, even if the player didn't really give a shit about those units as they were. They had dialogue with the main characters, so they had a little bit of characterization, but aside from that, there's some element of like, oh, I'm invested in these units as assets for gameplay, and then I lose them through sort of no fault of their own. And that's exactly how the main character who is involved feels in that situation. And so the player can then sort of connect in that way. And there's probably more direct examples of that in some video games, but that's like the easiest one that came to my head immediately because I was just working on trying to make it a little bit more robust. So like stuff like that, I definitely think, challenging the player, throwing unexpected challenges at them or whatever, like whatever you can simulate, whatever way you can find to implement the story concept of the challenge that the characters are facing in their trials to the player and make it so that there's a bridge between the gap of the player and the characters. I think that's really important for making characters seem relatable in video games, in an interactive medium, where usually the characters are at the behest of the player in an RTS. So they don't really seem like, they seem closer to approximations of characters than actual characters, unless the player is invested in those characters' like struggles, at least in my perspective. Like I usually don't really give a shit about characters in campaigns, even though they are going through some challenging things, because usually there's no challenge in the campaign itself, so I don't really connect with the same challenge. And at least for me, it's way more effective when I'm really having to give my all and try my hardest to not be a shit player, and that's the only way I can succeed, and the only way I can bring success to this character. And I sort of like supplant part of my own struggles into the struggles of the character, and like I can see a mixing between the two.
Yeah, because in Apex originated as a rewrite for StarCraft. I basically challenged myself because I had all these old concepts and stuff I'd thrown out before, and I said, hey, I bet I can make a better StarCraft than Blizzard in a day. And I did. But of course, the whole goal wasn't just to remake StarCraft, because you can't do anything interesting with StarCraft anyways. It's just Warhammer. And so as time went on, and I tore more and more and more of StarCraft out of it, and the only thing that remained was like 2 or 3 names, I entered the stage where I had a universe that could passively look off as, Warhammer-ish, because you had the Space Marines, you had the Tyranids, you had the Eldar, aka Terran, Zerg, and Protoss. But the power level of everything in that world was so much higher than anything within StarCraft or Warhammer. Like, the humans are basically described as being able to just fabricate entire fleets in under a day. So one thing that StarCraft has never even attempted to do, that very, very few people attempt to do, at least correctly, is justify things that happen in gameplay through writing. And part of the reason why I rewrote a lot of things using StarCraft as a basis was because I was under the presumption I could never get custom assets for Terran and stuff like that, because there is none for StarCraft 2. There's basically no custom assets at all, just some lazy kit batches. And I wasn't going to settle for that. I was either going to make my own, or in all likelihood, I was going to have to try to just rework what I had. So I was kind of stuck at least with the Terran. I wasn't really sure how I was going to keep Zerg or Protoss at that time. So I wanted to be able to justify. I was going to not half-ass it. I wanted to say, okay, so how do I justify all this stuff? Fabrication, nanites, and cloning, and stuff like that. So all that gets justified. I worked out all the technical elements. The vast majority of this stuff is never going to be exposed to the player whatsoever, except within an in-game library called the Codex that was going to be unlocked as you completed missions. You could get into the nitty-gritty technical details of how everything actually functioned in their history. But obviously, it's not something that really came up during in gameplay, except for some references. So I justify all that stuff, and then I sit down and say, okay, so now the player who is playing the role of someone who has amnesia, effectively, they don't remember anything, and they're getting thrust into this, and this player character is super powerful, but they're stuck in a situation of a completely alien world. And I want them to feel the struggle in which they have access to power, but they have to learn how to use it. and the enemies who are hunting the guy that's with him are actually hunting him, and they really, really, really want to get rid of him. Which means that, of course, as I stated in previous podcasts, you start off the tutorial, and your first objective is to survive a contain. This is one of the few static things that would exist in any of the entire campaign. The tutorial starts off with a bunker rushed contain. So the guy will surround you in bunkers and basically push you in with bunkers, and if that fails, he will reinforce them with siege tanks and tech up while continuing to basically build around you and try to contain you.
Right, so it's like a set piece as opposed to something that's just there through emergent gameplay.
So you start the game, and he starts the game, and by the time you're getting your barracks up, you're going to start seeing SCVs and stuff coming towards your base. And most people at this stage would probably die by the time the barracks completes. And that to me is fantastic, you know, because the barracks and the timing and the building and stuff like that, and the way that the AI is handed money, is all designed to be very real world balance, as if you're playing a multiplayer game and someone's trying to cheese you. I wanted to attain that feeling right away. And a lot of these people who play these are terrible players and don't know how to deal with a contain. They will freak out and start to panic, and they will really, really get stressed out by the sudden aggression, which is precisely what I wanted to capture. The contain and the AI behind it is not so aggressive that you need to have master's level skill to overcome it, but it's enough that you're probably going to have to reattempt the mission about 3 or 4 times. And actually, like, especially to learn to keep your money down is really the big thing, is to actually be efficient. So it starts off primarily with the lesson that manage your economy, manage your positions, pay attention to what's going on, because this enemy is actually going to be aggressive. And that sets a mood. And the biggest thing you can hope to do, especially in Build and Destroy, where you don't really have a lot of luxury to constantly flood dialogue and stuff with the players, is mood. You want to establish mood. And that can be done with subtle lighting, not this overblown bloom fucking specularity crap that certain campaigns use and try to pass off as custom lighting, the fucking Neanderthals. And music, which, again, nobody really seemed to do too much with. There was this obsession in StarCraft 1 with people using like Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger music and stuff, and I
Pokemon.
think some of it can be used, but you want to use tracks that are consistent in sound quality with everything else that is going on. Well, StarCraft happens to be exceptional in that it's using a lot of Hollywood edge sounds and some custom stuff, and of course all the custom voice processing that they have that is actually relatively high quality, especially for 22KHC, which means that if you're using SNES music, in all likelihood it's going to sound really, really discordant with the sound effects. Also, it tends to be too dominant. So every instance I've seen people use custom music in StarCraft, it ends badly for them. Except for some internal projects where people show me the examples of the music they were going to be using, and I can't really tell you if they were going to work that well because I didn't actually see it in gameplay. But I had a habit of doing a more Japanese-styled approach to the presentation. You may note that with Castlevania and stuff like that, the music and things tend to be more energetic and more upbeat. Whereas you may have noticed that, especially with Western titles, for example, StarCraft, that they tend to try to be more ambient. But the Castlevania titles and stuff like that are much more immersive and engaging. Now, not just by extending them being more faster paced and everything like that, but because the presentation tends to be more energetic as well. There's more player engagement and more responsiveness and stuff going on. And even though I only played Symphony of the Night for the first time, you know, like a year, two or 3 years ago, and it's obviously very, very dated by modern standards, I couldn't help but actually feel like, you know, this really synergizes very well. Everything really fits together very well. So this is going more or less into telling a story without telling a story, but you want all your elements to eventually fuse together. So when you're building your world, the second thing I would recommend you is find music that identifies with the mood of your world. Music to me is one of the most powerful things I use when creating something, whether it's for Dungeons and Dragons or for Apex's original concepts in StarCraft 2 when I was writing out like the 6th or 7th iteration of the script. Music sets a mood. It's the entire purpose of music is to set a mood. Now, maybe it's something like jazz, maybe it's something like dubstep, maybe it's sonic, erotic ASMR. Whatever it is, mood is very, very powerfully conveyed through sound. And you're going to have custom sound within your campaign. If you don't have custom sound within your campaign, well, you're kind of throwing away like half of the power over presentation that you have available to you, which probably makes your presentation really bad.
I would say it's even more than half because most people are like custom assets, visual assets are way more hard to come by than, you know, custom audio
Yep.
that you can generate yourself or find from plenty of Google searches. Like you're going to have way more hits for whatever music genre you're searching for than you are for custom sprites that fit your specifications.
Yeah, I don't need to tell you guys how to get music. The vast majority of people pirate music through YouTube, but you don't want to be using YouTube in something like StarCraft 2. It produces low quality audio, but everybody knows how to acquire music. I don't need to instruct you how to get that. Music research, however, is a very large subject, one outside the context of this one, maybe I'll get into later, because I actually take music very seriously. I take audio representation super, super seriously. And there's one thing I've always prided myself in, and that's the feedback I've gotten in regards to my music selection. One of the projects I made that was not public, that did have some players for it, was Lowlands of Legend 2042, a total conversion for Age of Wonders 2. I'd converted about 10 out of the 15 or 16 races that are in that game into basically colossal monstrosities. And it was a hugely dysfunctional mess. But I'd also put in about 20, 30 gigabytes worth of custom music. And I didn't really have any control over how that music was played, which was especially important for the battle tracks because there's only 2 battle tracks. So I ended up like hand mixing about 50, 60 minutes worth of music together for those battle tracks each. And I got a lot of praise for the selections in that because, you know, obviously when you're looking for music for something, you want to create a mood. Well, in Age of Wonders 2, which is a turn-based game, a lot like Heroes of Might and Magic 4, in the multiplayer, you don't have story. There is none. There's unit descriptions, which I put a ton of time into, but it's like a melee game in Brood War, basically, just longer. And the thing is these melee games, since it's turn-based, you can go on for, it's like Civilization. You'd be playing the same game for hours to hours to hours to days, you know. So you want to have a music selection that is diverse enough to fit that, which is, of course, when you're talking about StarCraft 2, every single mission should have unique music, a unique playlist of music. I had unique music for every single character and every scene involving those characters. Those were all synergized with each other. Generic moods based on the intensity of the mission. So in Apex, you were going to be fighting against the demon race Armageddon from Armageddon Onslaught, except now they actually had a reason to exist and it wasn't just a tech demo anymore. Each wave that Armageddon was going to send at you, each tier and each phase of each tier, all had music setting designed to suit the mood of what was sent at you and the pacing of how that fight was going to go. That means if it's going to be a small bloodbath map with just like a couple of zealots, you probably don't need to have death metal with like freaking Britney Spears screaming into the microphone and doing growls every 5 seconds at like 300 BPM drums. You want to pace it to the content, and that's going to set a mood, and then you can rely a little less on spamming the player with the dialogue to tell you that stuff is going on, because so long as the difficulty and the gameplay is engaging the player, the music will complement that, and that's going to do a lot of legwork for you in actually building the world, because it's going to build a mood, and a lot of the player engagement is going to come from that mood. It's going to come from that mood. If the player is very detached, no amount of dialogue is going to save you. You need to be able to set the mood in order for the dialogue to really have impact to begin with. Think of it as like building a foundation, not a marmalade.
Well,
Also,
that sounds like a good idea.
I'm going to grab some coffee.
You grab your coffee. So, one of the things that I think is the most important thing to take away from any discussion related to sound is that it does exactly what Mesk was talking about, where it sort of tells a story without telling a story. It's that stuff that's always there, unless you're having no music for a particular scene, which can be a stylistic choice that can accentuate a certain mood in and of itself. But it can't be the whole thing. It has to be like, you know, people say, you know, there's like certain dialogue happening or whatever, and for whatever reason there's no music, and like, oh, what could that mean? But you don't want to have no music the entire time. That would be like a particular choice that you make specifically because you're like there's a significance to not having any music there. But aside from that, like it's stuff that's always there, and sound is always there. You're always hearing things, and hearing even in a visual media like games is really really important for setting the stage, for setting a mood, and it helps people interpret what they're hearing. I mean, you can have the like really really good special effects for a movie, but if you have really really crappy visual or audio, like the gun sound effects are ripped from like Call of Duty YouTube videos or something, like you're going to be in for a really rough time when trying to communicate something that has impact. And the same is definitely true for music in the same way. It probably even more important actually, because music is going to be heard most likely more than a handful of sound effects. There are going to be some sound effects that are probably used all the time in games, but I would say overall, you're talking about music that's going to be heard all the time. Just think there's a reason why a lot of people have really really emotional responses to music that they are personally attached to, and they probably have more emotional responses to audio compared to video. And I guess it's like a really easy way to write off video as being less important than audio, but I try to think of it as more important. Like audio is really really important. You really want to put a lot of effort into it. That doesn't mean you should put no effort into your visuals. It just means that like when it comes to setting a stage, especially in a mod where you have limited control over the visuals and the engine and the performance, playing music usually isn't that big of a deal. And even in certain cases where it is like Brood War, trying to have your own music system either means a really complicated trigger system or a completely different system where you're like modding something in that hasn't yet been done. Regardless of the context of how you're implementing music, it's usually a simpler solution than trying to get a bunch of visuals together, but also just an equally important, if not more important, solution, because you need to be able to set a stage that isn't just like the same 4 Terran Ready tracks or whatever, or Terran music tracks that are ambiently playing when you're playing a race that isn't Terrans. And generally you would want music that is unique to each mission. And that is definitely something that should be looked at from for the future, is how are you going to design missions in a narrative, or if it's a total conversion, how selecting themes is a little bit easier, but which themes are you going to select for individual factions or races that you're playing as, and what is the significance to that? It's got to be more than just, well, this sounds cool. There's plenty of Korean mods I've played where the total conversions result in like the audio being 2 Steps from Hell and X-Ray Dog or some shit. It's like you gotta diversify. You gotta have significance. Ironically, that stuff, even though it's really bombastic, since it's the same stuff over and over again, it ends up not feeling very unique at all.
Yeah, trailer music. I remember back when I was making Stabby, man. My original World of Warcraft. It's like the first videos I made. It was way back in like 2006, 2007. And one of the guys that I talked to that did High Warlord PvP back when it was actually a thing, top rank of the server, he introduced me. He's like, tell no one about this. I got access to these files. They just got leaked. And it was Immediate Music and X-Ray Dog and stuff like that when they first started getting leaked around. And then within a year, it was like everybody uses it, and ES Posthumous and a bunch of others. And it's like, yeah, don't. It's just generic music in general because it's just bombastic American crap. But it's also, the music is too short. It's designed for a trailer, a feature, and it's not designed for background audio. As a rule of thumb, when looking for background audio, even if I'm looking at building a playlist, because my playlist tends to be composited out of multiple pieces, each individual piece should be a minimum of 4 minutes. I sometimes settle for 3 if there's not a lot of action key points in it. I look for something that stays consistently paced, which unfortunately rules out a lot of classical, especially Chinese classical. And I look for something that doesn't contain a dominance in the same frequency ranges that a lot of sound effects do. So for StarCraft 2, if you're making a campaign, chances are you're replacing all the sound effects in StarCraft 2 because they're terrible, but also because they produce bad raids. And if you're interested in producing a custom world, you'll probably be producing custom units, at least to some extent, so you owe it to yourself to at least look into ripping sounds or something else and reprocessing them a little bit. pay attention to where the sounds dominate the frequency ranges. So, say for example, Protoss, their sounds would dominate sort of the mid to highs, and Terran would be mid to lows. Just as a broad generalization. I'm not actually sure if the Zerg and StarCraft 2 even have sounds. I think there's like a couple of squishy sounds of
It's
like
just
someone
Jay
rubbing
Wilson
their prostate.
farting.
There's like a sound of like someone rubbing their malformed prostate on the microphone, and it's like all slimy and squishy, and they just recycle that sound for every single unit in StarCraft 2. There's nothing distinctive about them whatsoever. So they just will get lost in any kind of music you have that takes the stage. So yeah, you want to just pay attention to these things because you don't want your music and your sound effects to be clashing with each other in the same channel, and your voices as well. So StarCraft 2 also features, I believe, audio ducking, which you can use to rebalance audio on the fly whenever you have dialogue or something similar. So you'll probably want to be looking into that when you start using custom music with your voice-acted dialogue that you will no doubt be creating.
We can hope.
There really should be no hope. I don't think anybody would release something that isn't voice-acted in today's day and age.
Well, you
clearly
it's so
haven't
easy to
get into.
You have not been paying attention to what's being publicly released lately.
I try not to for my blood pressure.
Well, let's just say you might need new medication after this is over. At any rate, when it comes to designing audio or whatever, I think audio is a big part of like characterization, because even when you're not when you're, especially in an RTS, right? Your eyes, like if they have this like eye tracking thing in CS:GO now, and even in CS:GO, a shooter, they have the players constantly checking the minimap, constantly looking for information on the radar, and it's like comparatively to the rest of the screen space, it's so small, but their eyes are constantly darting between like peripherals, choke points, and entry points to the bomb sites, and the radar, and they always go to the radar before they go anywhere else. Like this is like a constant thing that you'll see with top pros, is that when they have this eye tracking, they always are using this technique where they look at the radar, then look at somewhere else, then look at the radar, and then look at part 3 of the map or something like that. And they sometimes toggle between the center of the screen where their crosshair is as well. And the reason why this is an important distinction is because players are not always going to be focused on what's directly in front of them. Sometimes they're going to be checking the minimap for any updates. And sometimes they'll be tunnel visioned on a very small part of the screen. And in either instance, you want your audio to be able to do for the player what their eyes cannot currently do, which is read the rest of the game that is going on, that is available to them. All of the visual and audio information that is available should be easy enough to read. And audio reads are really, really important. Recently, I've been updating in Consummate, and one of the things that I did was I changed up how one of the characters' passives work, and they have an audio cue when their next attack is ready to stun. And this is a very simple thing to put in the game. I guess maybe it's a little bit more complex than some people, but for most people who are just doing random iScript stuff, you can just have some random conditional jump or some like sig order or something, and you can figure out how to play a sound. And that sound is going to tell the player, hey, now I can use this passive thing. Like, it's ready. Okay, now I'll interact with the hero in a certain way, and now I'll be able to do this. And that's that's the end of the conversation, but it's communicating that information in a way better way than certainly a way more consistent way than flashing something visually and not having the audio read. The audio read was the first thing I thought of putting in, and I ended up not going with the visual read because I couldn't find anything that satisfied me. But the audio read itself is perfectly fine because it plays as long as the hero is within the peripheral vision of the relative screen space, because sounds in StarCraft play as long as they're in the relative screen space area. They just play at like a reduced volume, and they have this weird. Do they have directional stuff in StarCraft? I don't think so. I think they just lower the volume in general.
In StarCraft 1 or 2?
In StarCraft 1, because all the sounds are mono. I'm pretty sure they
sounds
just play...
are going to be mono in 90% of things you can be looking at. I think there is actually directional sound to...
I guess it probably...
it's been a long time since I've played it, so I can't say for sure. But
it's just something I haven't really paid too much attention to. But the bottom line is that as long as the character is relatively in the frame or like immediately outside the frame, and he's a character that you're supposed to play, spend quite a bit of time micromanaging, because he can offer you a lot if your micro is up to the task. You're talking about somebody who's, if they're a player that's at the high end of skill expression, they should be able to, explain their, or rather read the game and use that read to justify further action in the game. And yeah, I see Hoop Thrower in the chat mentioning the Age of Empires 3 trumpets, where even if you are focused on the units that are in the middle of combat, they will still play the alert sound, which is like the most aggravating thing possible because battles in that game do not end quickly in most cases. So you can just imagine multiple battles
in
breaking
StarCraft 2,
out.
I fucking hated that. It was such a nightmare in my campaign because you have these alerts going off that your ally is under attack in the Zerg mission. Your ally is never not under attack.
Yeah,
the Zerg send 50 infestors every couple of minutes to land in his base and shit infested Terrans on him. And there are times, I have a screenshot where you have like 30, 40 of these notices stacked on top of each other. And I was trying desperately to remove all the pop-ups and like the little pop-up, your computer is slowing down the game. And all the other like shit with little X's on them that just sit in the fucking front of the view. Like,
you want to talk about obstructing reads. Just talk about StarCraft 2 in general.
Yeah. Well, the fact all the impact sounds and attack sounds and stuff for the Terran are all the same. They're all using the exact same explosion sound and everything, and all meshes into each other. You have no visual read or audio visual reads.
Yeah,
it's just a fucking disaster.
That is a disaster, and that's why I wanted to bring up audio reads in particular, because they are really important, not just for setting the stage, not just for it's not just one thing. It communicates information in a gameplay sense to the player, but it also communicates to the player a sense of characterization of the setting. And like based on the sound gives something that, regardless of its visual characteristics, it does give a certain element of the world character. Like if your rifles for your Terran makeover faction that you've converted into something completely different, if they have like a completely distinct sound from the base game, then they should, that's going to make them feel very different to the player, even though it's not something that they're looking at visually. It could be the same marine graphic, even though it shouldn't be. But if you're replacing the sounds of their attacks and the weapon graphics in some capacity, the projectiles, you'll see a very different sort of gut reaction to using them, a very different player feedback to using them, just because of the sound alone. And that is a huge change that can be done just based on audio. So, there's plenty of... I think one of the things that I recently, or not very recently, I guess it was like a year or two ago, I picked up, there's like this guy on one of the Steam forums that has ripped all of the audio files from all of the Halo games, all of the Mass Effect games. The Fear games in particular have been really useful. The first Fear game and its expansion packs were pretty useful for stuff that I ended up pulling for countless projects. And Bulletstorm has some okay sound effects. You'll probably get some decent stuff out of any of the Warhammer games if he's ripped those yet. So you could just find this stuff by Googling around, like, game rips of sound and music. You'll find a lot of useful audio for any sort of project. It's going to take a lot of research. It's going to take hours pouring through folders trying to find the right file. But when you find it, you'll probably know. And at the very least, it'll be good as a placeholder until you find something better. And it's better than nothing for characterization. It'll help you learn more about the setting that you're creating, because it's sort of like there's this weird concept that I've tried to my best to articulate, and it's sort of funny. It's ironic that I've had difficulty articulating it because of the subject itself. But when we have a thought in our head, even when we're not trying to communicate that thought to anybody else, we're just trying to like flesh it out in our own heads and try to make it best. Like what has helped me the most is speaking that thought into existence or writing it down. And the way that you do it, you start to think about it in a very different way. You start to conceptualize whatever that thought was. It almost becomes a real thought instead of this like sub thought in your head. If it's just in your consciousness, you just have this idea, but you never write it down. You never speak about it. You never record a log about it. You never do anything. And so it just exists in your head. And it sort of like slowly becomes more and more, or I guess less and less defined, more and more undefined, where suddenly you don't really know what its essence even was to begin with, because it's been so long. And if you can find a way to like record that information digitally or with a piece of paper and a pen, it'll help you figure out what you're really after, what the essence of your ideas really are. And it'll take you down paths you probably never thought you were going when you initially had the thought to begin with. And that has been really, really helpful for me. And obviously, when you when you have a thought and you're trying to explain it to another person, especially, it really helps to have done this before, because then you've sort of already explained it to yourself, so you can explain it to somebody else. And because I've explained this so many times, I guess I was a little more cogent than I expected. But the main idea of recording stuff like this, writing stuff down, is because and having some sort of test, getting your hands dirty right out the gate, getting something done, and then being able to look at that something as a something of a demonstration or a tech demo, something. And it's, wow, this is a material product. And even though it's really rough around the edges, even though there's not a whole lot going on yet, even though it's just potential, really, it's still more definitive than if I had never acted on this idea at all. And now I can start to see how the rest of the painting will take shape when I start painting the rest of it. I've got my canvas, and I've started to figure out what is going where, or puzzle pieces, whatever analogy you want to go for. At least if you have something, at least if you have one of the pieces to the puzzle, you can start to visualize the rest of them coming to shape around it, and figuring out whether or not that's even the right puzzle piece, and figuring out whether or not you're going to reshape it. The point of the matter is to actually get something done and get something to work with, especially with a custom setting, with your own universe. People are right to be sort of like apprehensive at first about like, oh, I don't really know if I write great ideas. No, you're probably going to write shit ideas, but the point is that the more you do it, the better you're going to be. And Mesk, you were talking about this yourself. Like, you said that your writing skills aren't that great, but people were still enjoying the content that you were putting out there in the form of writing and in the form of whatever else that you've done, regardless of anybody's skill. As long as they're able to actually get work done, that's more than most people who have had creative ideas will ever get done. Just getting some sort of proof of concept out there. And when it comes to creating an entire new setting, it's an ambitious idea, but it's not without, it's not just like completely out of your reach. It's something that you just have to work towards, and it's going to be a slower process than most people would like, because everybody likes instant gratification. But unfortunately, that's just not how creativity works.
Yeah, for Apex, there is, like I said, there's been like 6-7 major rewrites. And a huge chunk of that is mission scripts that contain, like, all the missions basically contain nothing but dialogue. Some of them contain ideas or whatever for the gameplay, but most of the gameplay, I figure I just improvise on the spot based on the dialogue. And then there's the radio play concept that was blocked out. There's the various Unreal 4 iterations that were blocked out. And then there's just excess floating bits where I came up with, so basically my design process is I figure everything out in my head, I view a scene in my head, and then I write down what I'm seeing in my head. It's like describing a movie. So I can, on the fly, just conjure characters, conjure worlds, conjure backstory, conjure names. Like, to me, that's second nature. It's like my stand. I can just snap my fingers, and there you go. I've got a world the size of StarCraft. I've got, 2 or 3 dozen characters involved with it. To me, it's nothing to do that. But a lot of it just ends up getting wish-washed out because it all sort of blends into the same thing. But when I find something that I really stick with, usually it's a chunk of dialogue, I end up writing that dialogue entirely without context and just let it sit there. And sometimes later down the line, I either scrap it or I find a use for it. So segment 0 of Apex, for example, is just this hodgepodge mishmash of random shit thrown together from similar brainstorming things. And if you read it now, it's going to be a hideous fucking mess. But like, it reads like a technical script or a legal document with dialogue in it. Like, it's very brute force, I would say, very raw, but all the ideas are there. So, it's more or less on me for just not being a good descriptive writer at all. But the fact that they're there means that later on, at whatever time I have the leisure to look at it again and iterate it if I want to. And the campaign is very much the same way. As I tested ideas within StarCraft 2, I found that they weren't very pleasing. Much the same sense why I never played in the RPG maps, is because all the iterations I've seen other people make were basically the same as the one I had make, mediocre and uninteresting. So, my experiments then shape what I divert my energy towards. So, iterating and throwing out work and revising everything like that comes with the process of anything within custom content creation. And you should be well prepared for that and be prepared to reflect on it as well, while you're throwing out things and revising them or whatever. And when you can come back within a couple of weeks, couple of months, couple of years and look at what you've done and why you want to change it, you're going to discover a lot about what you actually want. And it's going to be a very difficult question for you to ask. Oh, I hear some beats. I hear some beats. Here comes Tyrone. He's going to knock down your door and hand you a bucket of pizza.
It's a good thing I get the opportunity to mute my mic on the stream while you're talking, because otherwise it would just be a hodgepodge of constant fucking car noises.
So, I forget where I even fucking was at this stage, but the nut that you burst in that Sonic ASMR, the nut of it is that making a world is really not that difficult, but you're gonna probably come into it with an idea that you're gonna find is not going to endure the test of time. Because most projects, regardless of what those projects actually are, whether there's something based on some fan fiction, like, for example, Sonic X Shadow, or Rainer X Horner, or something completely original from the ground up, you're going to find along the way that your desires changed. What you really saw value in changed. And that's why I really try to hammer it into people to integrate the gameplay and the story together as much as possible, to really focus on something that's actually engaging. It's not just for the sake of the people playing it, it's for your sake. And that's why I find that developers who don't actively engage their own projects, for example, people who just have other people make their project for them, they not only are super distant from the project in terms of its development, so it's kind of just somebody else's pet project, and you're kind of just hanging along, but it also means that you're going to find very little actual substance in what is going on. And from what I've heard, that is a problem with the vast majority of StarCraft 2 projects that have been or were at one point developed. I know there's a large problem with a lot of StarCraft 1 projects that I was involved with that were run by other people. It's one of the reasons why I don't run with other people, because the leaders were unwilling to learn and carry things on their own. And as a project lead, you will be the driving force behind your project unless you happen to sucker people into doing the work for you. Upon which case, you're going to end up with a fucking mess no matter what you're doing, because chances are you don't have the skill or the intimate relationship with the people behind it necessary to produce your vision through their hands. Which means you're going to want something that you're going to be able to want to stick with and feel motivated to stick with through that test of time, which means that the project that you're creating and the elements that are in it, its world, its characters, its setting, and the gameplay that's coming from that, has to be something you yourself enjoy playing, even if it's something that is objectively really garbage, like QTEs or fisting yourself. You really have to at least be able to stand with it for a couple of years, because even small projects, like, for example, Dota, or, some micro maps in StarCraft 2, they're going to take a lot more time than you anticipated, which means your patience with what you've created is going to be tested. And you're going to find yourself along the way asking yourself a lot of questions about stuff you previously created, and if you should change it, certain stories, elements, characters, stuff like that. Change is all right, but I think more important than the fact of changing things or iterating on things or working on things is understanding the hows and whys of why you're doing it. For example, if you're doing it because you think someone might be offended, for example, if you're removing bouts of dialogue because you think it might be too socially sensitive, that's a bad reason. That's a very bad reason, because now you're taking in the conjecture of what other people might think about what you're doing for yourself, and you're making changes based on that. It's like shaping your commentary in a video like certain other casters do, because they're afraid of being seen as too mean or too insensitive or uninviting to certain crowds. They start mediating what they say. They start policing everything they do. It becomes an extra chore. Everything they do suffers. And at the end of the day, they're not really doing what it was they set out to do. They're going to struggle to find real engagement as a result of basically conducting a chore, forcing themselves to make something for this, something for that, which means, of course, at the base of it all, when you're making a world and you're writing characters, you're building a campaign, whatever the fuck you're doing, it's for you, right? It's for you. You're making something for yourself to enjoy. Don't ever walk into this with a conjecture that you're going to make some super successful campaign, especially when we're talking about something like StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 is dead. There's maybe a dozen people who might download your project. Out of those, maybe one or two people might get past the first map. Don't be looking into this to get popular. You're going to disappoint yourself really badly. Unless you happen to have the kind of media presence that, for example, Carbot had. Carbot obviously was an established name. But even so, how many people today do you see talking about StarCrafts, the mod? None. It's dead. Gone. Done and dead. It was popular for a day, disappeared off the face of the earth. But these individuals need to be invested into these projects, so when that happens, they're not disappointed by that. You have to build something that you yourself can be proud of, which means you have to be willing to stop and iterate on it and look at what you're doing and rebuild it or build upon it or make whatever decisions without any outside influence, anybody telling you what to do. You know, you can go fly in the contrary in the face of everything I've ever told you to do. It can be completely retarded. But if that's what gets you going, then that's how you're going to finish your project, and that's how you're going to feel good about yourself in doing so. Because at the end of the day, all of this is a hobby. You know, you're doing it because you want to do it for yourself. That means you owe it to yourself to put in the time to make a high-quality project in your eyes. Building a world is the first step to doing that. Because if you're building off of somebody else's world, you've already thrown away all your opportunities to make writing that you can be proud of. Because you've basically just taken in something someone else has done and sidestepped the equation entirely and just said, I don't want to write because writing is difficult. And make no mistake, throwing things into other people's writing is also very difficult. It's certainly more difficult than making a world from scratch. But the thing is that you are enslaved to somebody else's vision. If you decide to just completely rewrite that vision, you're going to end up with a mess. If you adhere to that vision, whole, true, and sound, you're still adhering to somebody else's vision. So, you know, like I said, a lot of people I talk to making projects, they say they don't have the drive to try to get into writing. They don't think they're very, you know, engaged in the creative process. They don't think they can do it. You want to know what happens? None of them finish a project. None of them. And these aren't random nobodies either. These are people with real technical skills behind them that most certainly possess the ability to make whatever project was in their hands. But since they didn't have the drive to actually really get into the grit of being creative, of problem solving, of addressing these questions in the design process for their projects, of course, when the going got tough and production slowed down or they ran into some other issue, their first gut instinct was to tap out, as opposed to roll with it and adapt. So, I think for people looking to make campaigns in today's day and age, at least the creative exercise of making your own setting and learning from that will help prepare you for the more difficult times down the road when it reaches all this technical drivel of dealing with garbage like triggers and, you know, iScript and 3ds Max and all this other shits, that you have that vision giving you the motivation to actually slog through it. The interaction of building and designing, of pouring creative energy into something you're doing, unlike my fucking speech, that's the driving force that's going to carry you through the harder times. Because make no mistake, no matter the project, there's going to be hard times. There's going to be times where you're going to have to probably scrap a lot of what you've learned, a lot of what you've already done, or relearn entire things, or really ask yourself some really difficult questions like I had to do with Retribution. Like, how do I salvage 6-7 years of work when no game engine can accomplish what I want, and I don't possess the skills to make the machinima out of it? If you really, really, really are invested into it, like I was invested into it, I mean, I poured my entire life into making the world behind Retribution, then you try to make those meet, and at the end of the day, you just may have a completed project out of it.
Well, I think the whole talk about not having a sort of unifying vision that will carry you through the slow points in development, and it could be something completely externalized as well. It could be some personal drama, some financial shit, whatever the case may be, where you are somehow removed from the ability to work on your project. And that could be even more demoralizing than just not finding any motivation anymore. You still have the drive, but you can't like act on your desires. And that can be even more frustrating depending on the person. But regardless of the case, the idea of not having the motivation or the unifying drive to the vision to give you the necessary endurance and allow you to last through whatever hardships are going to come along during the development of your hobby is something that I completely lacked in my early days. And it was only when I started to really develop a strong passion and was lucky enough to get the availability and like the personal, like basically the hand was dealt, and I had like the skies opened up and gazed upon me, and I was like, oh, heavens above, I can actually work on a project for X amount of months in a row or whatever. And that is like, you know, really the biggest stroke of luck I had received in the past couple of years, in addition to like the other things falling into place. Like I had scrapped enough projects to sort of know what was good and what was bad on an intuitive level without really analyzing it too much. And, you know, I was able to complete a project for the first time in 10 years or more than that, probably like 15 years. So it was definitely a process for me. And I think learning that, you know, the vision, the process is more important than the product. And the idea that you are like, it is a hobby, but you're putting effort into it because it's something you want to do. That's the only reason you would do this. And as long as you still want to do it and you stick with wanting to do it, you're going to be able to eventually cross that finish line. But there's a lot of things that are going to pop up beforehand, and there's even instances where you think you'll be done and you won't be. And especially with like individual assets, but also like, oh, you released it, well, now you got to watch for bugs and patch stuff and all this other stuff. Even if you're just releasing it privately, or even just doing it, you know, you don't release it at all, but you're done with it, and then you go back and play it like a month later and you realize that there's some things you want to change still. You know, you're never really done with an individual project until you decide, you declare to yourself, I'm not working on this anymore, I'm going to move on to something else. And that's when you can consider yourself actually done. You let the chips fall where they may, and you've analyzed the end product and you've learned from it. But at the end of the day, you do have to look at whatever you're working on in the moment and say, you know, what is compelling about this and what isn't compelling about this. And basically, I mean, I look at it very mathematically. This probably doesn't work for everybody, but I look at it like, you know, does the end justify the means, essentially, and do the pros outweigh the cons? And usually they do for my projects. I you know, there's like some stuff like the remastered shit that I was trying to do that definitely didn't, because everything I wanted to do I couldn't do because it was remastered. So, you know, aside from that, there's really hasn't been anything recently that I've thought, well, I'd love to do this, but only if the stakes were correct and all of the luck was in my favor. Like I've developed the ability to stick through projects through like the thick and thin of it, as long as the projects themselves are supplying me with that motivation. And I guess I'm not really doing too much besides echoing what you were talking about earlier anyways, but one thing I want to go back on is somewhat related to this. You mentioned that you had a strong distaste for narratives early in the podcast, and you describe narratives as like something that was sort of in the past, or something that was already concluded, and not something that was being interacted upon by the player. And I want to get your take on, like, you know, well, I think I already know what you're going to say about this anyways, but I'll just give what I think, and you can riff off of that. When you're building a world, you have to build the history of that world into it. So you're sort of creating a narrative, even if it's not ever spoken or presented to the player, because you're creating like an account of all of the events of every character's life, of all of the tech and stuff. Like, you don't have to go far back to like the Big Bang or whatever, but you should go back enough to know enough about the world and its genesis to be able to describe it in like an elevator pitch or layman's terms. And the idea being that you have made your setting believable, or at the very least, like consumable in a sense, where you can convey information in a decent, reasonably concise manner. And when you do that, you'll find what ideas are good and you should stick with, and what ideas you should probably axe. And usually it's directly related to what ideas can't be conveyed reasonably, without like a lot of like prior knowledge and stuff. At least that's been my experience personally. So when dealing with constructing this sort of essentially what is a narrative, like this account of how things came to be, the histories for all the characters and the histories for the setting, what do you encourage people to do? Like you said that you can conjure that up very quickly when you're talking about characters and how quickly you create worlds. How would you recommend somebody who's never really done that before and only ever done that with like characters within a setting that wasn't their own to begin with, like a StarCraft character, a fan character that they made? Like how would you encourage people to start breaking into that in the context of their own setting?
How do you mean presenting it to the player or designing from the
Just
ground?
designing from the ground up and then moving into like from there. You can talk about presenting it to the player afterwards. I think you briefly touched on that earlier anyway, so you could talk about that as well.
So let me think of a good example, because this could send us down a long goat hole. Okay, so Starsworn, my D&D campaign. So D&D is an interactive medium, and it's kind of expected you're eventually gonna go through a lot of information. So someone I know is running a campaign for both an offline group, his real life friends, and an online group, people he knows on the internet through a service called Roll20. And in both instances, this world is built off of a starter campaign called Lost Mines of Phandelver, the 5th edition starter campaign. But he's like rewritten it. Like everything is really different. And so even then, you know, even though it's like a starter campaign and most of it's based in the existing D&D setting and all the existing D&D rules, you know, it's projected in a way which, for example, I myself, which have very, very little real world setting of D&D. I mean, I know what an elf is, I know what a dwarf is, I know what a drow is, you know, I kind of know other stuff like what a gorgon is, what a chimera is, but I walk into this world, I don't know anything about, you know, who this handsome young wife is, who Toblin Stonehill is, who this god is, what this town's doing, all this other shit. So it's kind of just expected there's going to be, at some point, when you start actually digging into this stuff, there's going to be an ocean of data you've got to assemble. So the primary reason of doing that in the character to the player is to do it through a character. So in Apex, in the StarCraft 2 campaign, anytime it comes up where you need to learn about the, you know, the beginning before the trial, the first aspect of the 3 stage, you could say, even though the story is not really written in that manner, but to simplify it, that's always portrayed through the character. So the way I actually do that in designing it and building is actually not that really that different at all. It wasn't always like this, but it was a process I designed for Apex to do things very quickly. Because Apex was always written as a dialogue-first script, almost like a movie script, in which descriptions to what was going on was super, super minimalistic. I'm talking like there are several missions within StarCraft 2 edition of Apex, say version F, that have about 50, 60,000 words in them. And I believe at some point someone had said that Antioch 3 had 26,000 or something for the entire campaign. Maybe. So there was some dialogue. It was basically insinuated there was going to be some pretty long cinematics between missions. So, and then this was adapted for the Unreal 4 version where there was more like dialogue when you were moving around the map and stuff like that. I don't mean like Last of Us, we strip all your control, you have to sit through this fucking dialogue. I mean, when stuff is happening, players are communicating, that's how information is being given to you. That's actually how I designed the world and the backdrop and the settings. So the process I devised for Apex and Starsworn is, like I said, I don't really like the process of planning. I'm not a planner. I always have an idea of where my destination is going to be. So, say for example, in the campaign, when I first designed Apex, I broke away from the Armageddon Onslaught 2 concept because mods are impossible in StarCraft 2. There is no mod support. There can't be an Armageddon Onslaught. It's impossible. So then I adapted a single-player campaign. And when I started off with that, all I had was the idea, okay, so you're going to be fighting this demon race that's super strong. And I wanted to preserve a lot of the things that Armageddon Onslaught had. Names, unit designs, the concept of the waves and stuff like that. I wanted to create the same kind of immersive concept the Zerg originally had before Kerrigan and all this other trash got shoveled into there and destroyed everything. I wanted to create that primordial sense of the unknown, of the fear, and of the hostile. Kerrigan and things like that, they humanized the Zerg. They took out the fear of the Zerg. Now they look more, they had their face, they're represented by a human face that's very relatable, very one-dimensional, very understandable, and doesn't have any distinction to it whatsoever. It takes everything out. It guts them. It just leaves them on the lawn, just bloodied and dying. And then StarCraft 2 like pissed on it.
They're no longer forces of nature that cannot be understood or reasoned with. They're now like there's a human element to them.
So look at Warhammer 40k and the Tyranids that the Zerg were ripped off of 1-to-1 until Blizzard decided to tack shit onto it. The Zerg in the initial concept are so similar to the Tyranids, you got to wonder why there's no lawsuits going on. And that's great because the Tyranids on the superficial level don't really have a lot of explanation either. The Tyranids have hive ships and hives, and they come down and they eat planets. And basically, the only way to get rid of them is an exterminatus, to basically just obliterate the entire crust of the planet and leave everything dead. And even then, you've pretty much still basically lost the planet anyways. There's not really too much you can do. So the Tyranids are laid out as this both a supernatural and a very real threat. Because you have like the warp and stuff like that in the Warhammer 40k universe. You can't always respond willy-nilly to these things showing up in outlier worlds or kind of running around. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. The Emperor is clinging to life by devouring psychers by the hundreds or thousands every single day. You got all this shit of living on the edge, and then on top of it, you got the Tyranids that are slowly just devouring everything. And the only response the super advanced civilization can have, who sits on the balance of being advanced but woefully, ignorant to the technology that had prior to the Black Crusade or something like that, and they're barely just like hanging on, so they don't really understand what the Tyranids are doing, only that their response has to be in full force. And the Zerg initially are like that, except you have the Protoss, the Eldar, jumping in and glassing things for you. The Terrans are kind of just picking their dicks because they're just criminals off of spaceships that are somehow reproducing like supercharged locusts, and they still don't really know what's going on. And then suddenly we throw Kerrigan into the mix, and all the teeth is gone, all the way up until the Overmind is redeemed. And then Tessar becomes the Messiah, and it gets messy. So with Armageddon Onslaught, I wanted to dial all that back and say, okay, we can give the demons a face and a name, but everything really in how they work and what they're after is going to be pretty alien to you. Not to mention, Apex's primary focus point when it starts off is actually it warps around to telling the story of the demons as opposed to the story of the Terrans.
I got to sidetrack you real quick. Tassadar wasn't real. He was actually a conjuration of Xel'Naga energy. This is real from Legacy of the Void, so there you go. Metzen writes a character.
Oh god, it hurts. Oh, my heart can't take it. Oh, I'm in pain. So, oh god, I can't.
They had a giant tentacle monster that was like ripped from Mass Effect 3 or something, and he was like, Tassadar, the form I pretended to be to inspire confidence in the one called Zeratul.
So I'd like to since we're talking about like story and stuff, I'd like to tell you guys something you should probably avoid doing, and that is throwing away all the sacrifices and decisions and everything like the characters and everybody made up to a point, with one really, really poorly thought out plot twist for the sake of making a character nobody has any fucking interest in whatsoever seem slightly more angsty. Because that's what that does. That basically says that Tacitor is sacrificed to kill the Overmind and everything related. I mean, the fact that Overmind was redeemed to begin with already kind of does this. But that set the stage for the communication with Zeracool, the prophet of the new hip age, and Tassadar, where he discovers that Tassadar is actually Jesus. But even that gets tossed aside by that, because that's basically saying that, oh, it didn't matter if Tassadar died. You know, he wasn't real. It's like fucking democratic America. It's not real. We're all living in a police state. Trump's got us all locked down inside our houses. Blacks are being murdered on the streets as we speak. They're going to break into your house when you make fun of his tiny hands and beat you with sticks. It isn't real. The Freemasons have got ya. That's what it says. That... Wow.
Well, Zeratul died in the opening missions, so he didn't even get to see that Tassadar wasn't real.
I mean, he's a plant. Are plants real? Is this a simulation? This is a simulation.
Well, it's funny because you're talking about, like, don't throw away entire, like, sacrifices or just characterizations of previous works with, like, one line. That's exactly what happens when Tassadar says, "Forget what you know, Zeratul," when, like, talking to Zeratul over the corpse of the Overmind, and then he proceeds to, like, talk about how brave the Overmind was. So it's, like, exactly the same sort of concept. And actually, apparently, that was the same guy, since, of course, Tassadar wasn't real. So
Tassadar was probably a Gamergate survivor. That's why he was so brave. Wow. What a moving story from Chris Metzen. I'm just... I mean, I thought at this stage I couldn't have been more bamboozled by the sheer schizophrenia, the madness, the self-destructiveness of that drunk albino piece of shit that they had writing. I don't know what the fuck he was writing, like a snuff film for that fucking game. But that, I am both not surprised at all by that revelation, but at the same time, so utterly disgusted.
I still can't believe they turned Kerrigan into an actual space chicken. Like, that, for some reason, that was more offensive to me in the moment. But, I mean, they resurrected Phoenix, they removed retcon Tassadar, I don't know, they did a lot of stuff in StarCraft. A lot of things happened.
Go through Heat of the Swarm, slugging through these boring as fuck point-and-click micro missions, thwarted by rocks and cliffs and indicators on the ground, and the end of the fucking expansion, Kerrigan just levitates off into the fucking air like Vegeta!
Yeah, well, at least when she turns into a Xel'Naga, she's actually able to fly.
Wow! Wow! When she turns into a Xel'Naga. Yes, that fucking cinema.
That's a real thing. The guy who's cosplaying as Tassadar gives her, like, a laser beam or something, and then she gives that laser beam to Amon, and Amon dies.
So, in Warhammer, which this is ripped from, you know, there's a lot of stuff, like, for example, someone gets blessed by a Chaos God, and they turn into an avatar of that Chaos God. It's like where demon princes and stuff eventually come from. And all this makes, like, perfect sense in the original context of the setting, is some of the more zany stuff happening. You know, people blessed by the Emperor, people using the Emperor to find their beacon through the warp and get to where they go, you know, the Chaos altogether, the Necrons, even the Tau. You know, even like the peaceful space goatsmen or whatever the fuck they are. Like, everything like that is kind of like grounded off to the original setting. So I'm not going to claim to be like super in-depth knowledge of Warhammer 40k because I'm not. But everything I've ever heard about it all makes perfect sense within the context of its original presentation. Because that's what the original presentation is. It's, these are the factions that are fighting this is why they're fighting, and this is how they're fighting, and then this is their story. In StarCraft, initially, it's like, here's the advanced plant people, the Eldar, not Eldar. Here's the Tyranids that are not Tyranids. And here's the Terrans that are vaguely like Imperial Guard and Space Marines, but we took out the religious context because some parts of America actually really don't seem to like religion for some reason. A lot of their censorship is related to that in any event. So that setting, in its grounding, has a consistency that's very similar to Warhammer, but not quite one-to-one.
Well, it's not nearly as wacky. Like, you have
No.
like the way that orc technology works in Warhammer 40,000 is just that orcs think it will work. They believe it works, so it works, and like that's
they painted it
literally
red, so it is actually faster.
Yeah, and like it's just because they have the power of they're literally like praying their weapons to work. Basically, it's like it's very strange. It's very off the wall. And if you're like really into grounded, like realistic science fiction or something, you're gonna be turned off almost immediately, or at least like flabbergasted, because I guess it does make sense in the setting itself. But it's not.
But that's
the same
that's
thing.
up front what it is, though.
Right, exactly.
Like, that's
it doesn't pull any
handed
punches.
up front.
Yeah, it's not gonna. It's not like hiding that fact. And at the end of the day, like I guess StarCraft 2 sort of ends up being as zany, but it's all unintentional.
StarCraft 2 ends up being so much worse. Yeah. Because StarCraft 2 is basically a series of plot devices, Mary-Sues, and random bullshit and retcons tacked on top of things, because you can basically see Metzen's decline into alcoholism and cocaine from where they basically ripped off Warhammer because they were denied the IP, so they were going to make Warhammer anyways. But then they decided they wanted to get creative. And whenever Blizzard tries to get creative, it just all slides down your leg like so much diarrhea. It just becomes a huge fucking mess. Every single thing they tacked onto it after they had that foundation just turned more and more and more retarded. Brood War was very retarded. Lots of stuff in the classic was retarded. But then StarCraft 2 basically says, we don't like some things that we did in this. So rather than exercise some of this budget we've got that we're paying for this man's alcohol, we're just going to pretend it doesn't happen. We're just going to pretend that huge chunks of our original manual and stuff just don't exist anymore. Then we're going to tiptoe around with some Mary-Sues and bring it all together with a love story for those warm, fuzzy feelings of all the people living in open relationships. And then you get StarCraft 2. And it makes no fucking sense in context of itself. It makes even less sense in the context of StarCraft 1, and it makes utterly no sense in the context of what was first presented to you whatsoever. Because when you start just fisting stuff out of your asshole, like keystones and space chickens and all this other stuff, I mean, you're expected to go through some kind of advancements and reveals and stuff as you go through. That's just something that's fantasy and science fiction. You know, you're expected to learn things. Like in Lord of the Rings, you learn how Sauron became powerful. You learn about the One Ring. You learn about the effects the ring have on people. You learn about, you know, the Wraith, whoever the fuck they are, the Nazgul. You learn about, you know, Saruman's orcs and stuff changes and advances, and you learn things like that. But all of them are sort of like grounded within the setting in a manner which is actually believable. This really like this, one of the more important things when you start like building your story is to not make so many on the spot decisions to justify something on a whim that makes no sense in the context of everything that's been previously established. The StarCraft 2 is so loose and so weird a writing to begin with that you do have lots of flexibility. You can just walk in there and say, oh, there was an ancient artifact that was actually the key to the end of all things, just kind of buried away because some orc thought process into an unbreakable rock that you needed Excalibur to break, and Tassadar actually was Excalibur. It was just Zeratul was too shy to grip the shaft. So then Tassadar wilted, as plants do when they're deprived sunlight, and then Zeratul wilted because he couldn't withstand the loss of Senpai, and then the world descended into darkness, and the dark voice literally fucking says, I love it! When, I can't even remember what it was, like when everything comes together or something, like it's the worst line a character of his type could say. It was so fucking awful, especially in the context of those missions. Like you're looking like visions or whatever of the future that would happen if you didn't save them from the big dark bad, and you get this disgusting fucking one-liner at the end of it. Just fills you with bile. Just don't do that.
Well, that's the other thing is, I mentioned earlier in the podcast that you look to the characters in a setting to, like, you play off of their reactions to stuff to determine how, like, common things are and how you yourself as an audience member or a player should be playing off of the environment. And in StarCraft 1, at least in the first, like, in the Rebel Yell campaign, there were weird things like IskatuMesk goes from nice guy to megalomaniac in literally one dialogue line. So
I find the side disruptor
really,
things very, very hard to believe.
Right,
because
so there's like
the
technological elements that are really weird, but the characters themselves don't, like, they play them straight most of the time. Like, Kerrigan has some exposition dialogue about it, but everybody else is like, okay, this is a tool now. We've established, like, even if it's not believable in the setting, the characters make it feel like this is something that exists in the setting. Like, they don't act like it doesn't make any sense. Whereas in StarCraft 2, you have like a literal god who's like saying really bad one-liners, and the reaction of somebody like Raynor is just to be like, "We'll get you." And it just completely falls apart. Like, dude, Raynor helped kill a god in StarCraft 2. That's where the story went. And he acts like it's just generic action scene number 69. He acts like it's nothing. He's just like, there's no Raynor. Okay, Amon is literally destroying parts of the void where Raynor's command centers are, and Artanis's nexuses are. And like, this is literally what Amon is doing. He's just tearing apart the fabric of reality around them. And they're just like, hey, Kerrigan, you better not let that happen to your base. And like, they don't react at all. It's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Like, the way that they play things perfectly straight that should not be played straight. That should be up, like, just absolutely insane. Like, they're literally in the fucking void dimension. These people are in a completely fish out of water situation, and the stakes have literally never been higher. Because we're talking about, like, what would happen if Amon returned? Well, you've already sent him back into the void with some convoluted keystone device, but after that, what happens? Well, if he's still alive, then he could come back and do the same amount of insane destruction that he did on the Caprilu sector in this campaign. So we got to stop him. We got to make sure he's taken care of. And they go into his realm and act like it's just any other mission from, like, the beginning of the campaign where there were no stakes, even though the stakes literally have never been higher. So I don't understand how you can do that. Like, that sends the complete wrong message to the player. The player is now no longer thinking, or never thinking, I should really be invested in this. There are stakes here. There's something that I should care about. There's something that if I fail, something really bad will happen. But the characters are acting like there's no consequence for failure. They're just, like, passionlessly delivering lines about, hey, don't let this gameplay gimmick kill your base. And that's it. That's the content.
That's actually something I want to bring up while we're here is, I was talking about anime and budgets and stuff. So it's sort of a cultural thing. It's what you're going to notice in Japanese animation in general. But the reason why the typical anime has, like, big eyes and stuff like that is because the animation and stuff like that is super, super focused on the portrayal of emotion and the portrayal of, like, responses to stuff happening. So I just watched Fate Heaven's Feel, the first one that came out. And it's still very much the same thing. To me, it's very similar to, like, when I was watching, like, Dragon Ball Z. And I watched a little bit of Macross, older Yamato, like, older stuff. Like, is super similar to me in that projection. That really hasn't changed. And it's in part because of budget, because they don't really have the budget to animate out, like, 30 FPS of constant animations all the time for every single muscle flexing. So you get a lot of the scenes where it's really just down to the subtle facial animations, because they recognize that a good chunk of it isn't just about the action. It's also about the characters' responses to things that are going on. And a lot of the, like, Fate, for example, if you're not familiar, Fate is...
yeah, I haven't watched any anime, so...
So, Fate is... we'll focus on the simple one with Emiya, Shiro Emiya. And he is just like a regular guy living in Japan. And he was like an orphan. He was brought in by a guy who died. He was his role model. and he's like a super free-going, easygoing guy, and he knows a little bit of super basic magecraft, but he's not like introduced to any of this wacky stuff. It's just like something he learned from his surrogate dad, his idol. And then one day he spots something. He was like there after school, late, doing stuff for someone, and then he spots something going on in a fight, and then he sees like some really zany shit because you have these supernatural heroic spirits trying to kill each other outside. And he tries to run and he gets gutted in the hallway and then wakes up alive again. And then he later discovers that he actually ends up summoning one of these servants and gets thrown into basically a war for the Holy Grail, where they are masters controlling these supernatural spirits. And he gets thrown into that. So you think, for this average guy who really only knows a tiny bit of this kind of supernatural stuff that's going on, nothing even remotely introduced to the mage world or anything, to get thrown into this wacky, crazy shit that's going on, how would a person actually respond to that? And a lot of Fate is about how he responds to that and how he tries to come to terms with it and how he tries to struggle with his ideals of, what people should be like, how things should be done and stuff like that. And a lot of that really comes down to struggling with the emotions and things like that and making the decisions. Whereas, for example, when I watched Transformers by Michael Bay, the way that they butchered Transformers in general was terrible, with all the visual noise and clipping and just technical clumsiness all throughout the place. They try to hide with camera shaking. But the human characters they have in there are so unlikable, so unrelatable, and just have no real grounding in the setting at all. But they keep panning to them. They keep drawing attention to them because their budget is small and they can't show the extent of the fights. But they know that everybody is only watching these shows is to watch giant robots kill each other. This is basically it. But if you look at even the animated Transformers movie from way back that I believe the company that made Transformers, they later decided it was not canon. They later, I think they said they regretted or pulled or something like that, because there was a lot of things that happened in it that they ultimately was received negatively. So, but even in that, like, there's the same kind of like human characters in there, but they're in the backdrop as they should be, because you're watching Transformers. You're not watching generic, super sauced up fucking teenager in college or something flailing around. But that's what it comes to. And amidst all this, these guys are doing absolutely ridiculous shit, not really genuinely responding to stuff that's going on. And the Amon thing, like the complete one-dimensional dehumanization of stuff while trying to force things back into being humanized. Like, for example, this battle in the void between a god and all of his godly mechanisms, who probably had something to do with creating the Protoss and the Zerg and everything in related.
Oh yeah, they retconned that out too. The Xel'Naga had nothing to do with it, and it was all him. He created the Zerg and the Protoss. By the way, he has no minions. Instead, he just clones members of all three races, and they have a shitty glaze on them, and that's his units.
Okay.
So there is no characterization to the setting, is what I mean. Like, he literally just attacks you with the same armies that you've been fighting the rest of the
but it's like, I'm going to ask, like, at what point does it make sense for Terrans to be able to even hold a candle to the Zerg or the Protoss? The Zerg, maybe if a small fringe Zerg brood attacks a huge Terran stronghold, the sheer amount of kinetic firepower they have, all the nukes they have and stuff like that, is going to hold them off. But against the Protoss,
exactly.
It's like, no way can you justify that. But then we have so many missions where the Terrans go against the Protoss. Raynor willfully fights the Golden Armada and wins. And it's like, you can't really believe that as a player, but you're playing it. And then the characters themselves, there's no connection going on. No concern about the fact they're fighting super advanced space trees that glass planets and mobilize a huge fleet, and now we're going to just cross with them. Like,
Well, that's the thing is what really disappointed me about the way that they interact, the Terrans and the Protoss, in something like StarCraft 2, or the Terrans and the Zerg as well, is that they don't really have any specialized tech. Like, they do have some campaign-specific units, but I understand in the multiplayer sense, okay, you have to have the races balanced, whatever. But
Yeah.
present the Protoss, like, Rebel Yell, in the first campaign in StarCraft, also has a really big problem with this, where they build up the Protoss as they just glass planets casually. They just fucking annihilate all life on a planet. They're basically the equivalent of Exterminatus, except it's carried out way faster. So it's like, okay, wow, these are really like tough cookies. We're gonna have to contend with these one day. And then you just fight them and they attack you with like 2 zealots. It's like nothing. So it's like real horrible characterization. But when you look at something like StarCraft 2, you had plenty of opportunities to explain through the use of way like super advanced technology in a way that would make sense for the Terrans have had years to adapt. They've come up with technology that somehow hampers the efficacy of Zerg and Protoss, and they sort of do that in Wings of Liberty, where they have like the psi disruptor thing that just lowers the movement speed of Zerg. It's the alternative to the hive mind emulator that mind controls them, but like they have nothing on Protoss. They actually, what really triggered me about one of those tech options was that in Wings of Liberty you could get these auto refineries that just get gas automatically, and the explanation in the lore for that is that they use Protoss tech, but the Protoss
pockets or something.
Yeah, they use Protoss warp tech to do it, but the Protoss have never used this. And the explanation for it, they hand wave it away by they say, perhaps they just lack Terran ingenuity and never thought of it. That's literally their explanation as to why the Protoss don't do it. And the Protoss do it anyways.
Excuses like that, and it makes no sense. Yes, a super advanced race that has lived far longer than yours and has far more people, far more minds to combine things, somehow has just magically never thought of using things in this way.
Yeah, well, the other thing is that the Terrans are never presented as like abnormally ingenious anyways. They're just humans. So it doesn't even make sense within, like, you can't even make an argument for it within the setting. It just seems to contradict elements of the setting where you've set up the Protoss as really advanced and intelligent. And it wouldn't even matter if the Protoss also had this technology. You could have introduced this as like part of that fucking Terrazine mission or something. Like, the Protoss have these things that automatically mine gas. Wow, who'd have thunk it? We can sample this if we do this optional objective or something. I don't know. Like, they could have done something like that where it actually establishes that the Protoss do have it, and then you wouldn't have had that inconsistency. It's like these lines of dialogue or tooltips or something do more damage than they do way more harm than good. But when it comes to actually setting up like believability and consistency within the setting, you have stuff like them going into the domain of a dark god who can literally like reshape the terrain that is being like played, the battlefield that is being played on, and these Terrans are more effective than the fucking Protoss in the mission on Brutal.
Oh dear.
So I agree with your estimation that it doesn't make any sense for Terrans to be there, but I also think that Blizzard could have made a way for the Terrans to make sense, where in that context that it could have made a way for Terrans to actually be like, you know, they had some people had alliances, like Raynor had alliances with Protoss or whatever at the end of Brood War. Not that they fucking kept Brood War canon anyways, but you know, you had material you could draw off of. You had 4 years between the two games. That's enough for some sort of technological achievements in some capacity. And yet they did nothing. They just have Marauders. I guess those hard counter everything the Protoss have, so.
Yeah, mass Marauders. The Marauder is such a stupid unit. Earlier you asked me what games I could think of to look at for examples for storytelling. On my LP list, Castlevania Symphony of Night and Castlevania Rondo of Blood are really the main ones that come up as having storytelling while also being presented in a way that isn't really obstructive. So those games are all dialogue driven. They're very, very simple. They do pretty much everything with gameplay. There's some dialogue between or after boss fights, and I think there's some couple of short cinematics, especially in Symphony of the Night, but very, very minimal. And those are Rondo of Blood is obviously not the hardest of the Castlevania games by far. I'm pretty sure Castlevania 3 is significantly harder. But it did take me about 7 or so hours to get through. Symphony of the Night is super, super easy, but is very visually impressive for sure. It shows you can do really, really smooth, like turning animations and movement and stuff like that on the character without ever sacrificing control whatsoever. So all these games that try to be realistic by making the controls sluggish, yeah, they're garbage. And
That's
Yeah,
just
those two
Dota.
games, I highly recommend both of those games. Symphony of the Night's major weakness is that it's very easy, like way too easy. And Rondo of Blood is like they're sort of different games. They're both like core Castlevania, but Rondo of Blood is a simple linear game in the older style, whereas Symphony of the Night is more along the lines of it's more RPG-ish. There's stats and leveling up and stuff like that, and the stats and leveling up are ultimately what makes it really really easy. But Symphony of the Night also has a lot of really unique items in it if you can figure out how to get them. Some that are quite well hidden, and yeah, when I think of like writing and stuff like that, I always end up thinking back to Castlevania because I have a lot of games I've recorded, and the closest to them in sort of modern games I've played would be Dragon's Dogma. But Dragon's Dogma was so incomplete and so westernized that it's really one of those games where it's like it's very clearly in dire need of completion. But there's a lot of really positive things about it. Like it's a game that you can't objectively look at and say this is a good game because it's just too incomplete and there's some really serious problems with it, especially with the expansion that was nothing short than a cash grab at the Souls crowd and it's horribly fucked. But what is there is like really promising and there's like some good dialogue in it and stuff like that. And the writing is nothing original. Again, you're not going to find really a lot of original writing in these, but the execution tends to be quite well. And a Bulletstorm, again, dialogue driven, pretty decent. Dark Souls 3, although I don't really consider it a good game, especially in terms of the writing, I will say that they actually, unlike the previous titles, tried to put in a story, and it's really, really subtle. It's more there, like it actually exists. Like the previous Souls games
It's
basically
not
have
just
no
item
stories at all.
descriptions.
Yeah, it like there's actually like dialogue and stuff in that game that's actually relevant to what's going on. And I didn't catch all of it in the run, but at the end of the game, I felt like I had actually played through something with an actual story behind it. And unfortunately, this really requires a lot of thinking and a lot of familiarity with certain ways of Japan telling stuff. And anime in general, if anyone, you or otherwise, any people listening, wanted to get into anime but didn't want to invest into something longer winded, but wanted to see an example of some, I would say, stylized, and I don't use this word very often, but I would say stylized storytelling. There is an anime here. Let me try to find a name for it. It's quite short. I saw a recommendation for it that basically said people couldn't understand what was going on. Don't try to understand. Just watch it for the pretty visuals. But I actually found it super easy to understand. I don't know if that's just something for me, but it's called. Is it in this folder? I have a Weeb folder, and Karas, Karasova. There should be 6 episodes entirely. So Karas is, again, there's nothing really original in here, especially in the context of Japanese stuff. You're going to see a lot of recurring stuff in Japanese, such as the concept of demons, contracts, demons living amidst humans, sort of things like that. There is a lot of showing and not telling going on with Karas. There's some things out of order. Another anime that people are also probably familiar with if they watch anime is Kara no Kyokai or something like that, in which individuals would recommend to watch the movies in a different order and then which they're presented, because there's a lot of transitions between past and present tense. But I never watched them in that order. I watched them as they were released, and again, I had no issues following them because the way in which they're shown in that manner is because of their actual relevance as opposed to their timeline. So, uh, the reason why I bring up those main examples is because I do use anime as a significant source of my inspiration for pacing, actually. So the main thing you'll notice with a lot of the cartoony animations, but especially those based on the Japanese, is sort of a bouncy style in which you have wind-ups and then super fast interactions and then pauses. Like it's hard for me to really put into words, but you'll know what I'm talking about if you're familiar with the subject matter. Is the pacing for timing, again, a budget thing, but also a way of psychological manipulation looking to grab engagement. So it's very different from something that's in real time, for example, live action. Although you will see lots of slow motion and stuff like that in live action, I've never seen it done anywhere near as good as something like Fate, for example, in which again, like it's hard for me to really put this stuff in words, but I tried to capture that within gameplay because the dialogue and stuff like that, I picture that all in my head in these scenes in sort of a similar style, and I try to write it out and try to bring it to gameplay. I want the gameplay to be like that, with points highlighting decision making, points highlighting action you could play an hour-long mission, but rather than being all super consistent, it was defined by a series of high points and then a series of breathing room. So, like I said, a high point would be that bunker contain I mentioned, and then another high point would you be breaking out the bunker contain, taking an expansion, and then a transition in the opponent's aggression to them responding to the fact you've broken the contain and stuff like that. So I think of things as a series of movements, if you will. Again, reference back to music. Music is a series of movements, of sequences of telling a story. I think of it in a very similar way. It's all very integrated. And that's why I say don't worry too much about being original. Don't worry about making a splash. Worry about finding something you want and then making it consistent with everything else that's going on, and then making your gameplay consistent, whether it's something like Build and Destroy or a moving Thrall through a series of boners.
Wow, it sounds like Diablo 3.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think is like a common denominator between all of these is, I'm looking back at just some notes that I wrote at the beginning of the podcast. We talked about keeping things simple, mastering the basics, analyzing like tropes or whatever, figuring out what has worked for most media. I say worked loosely. Just thinking
Figuring
about
out why, really.
Yeah, it's like what inspires you, and figure out why it speaks to you in that way. And usually it's going to be the simple stories that are told well, the bullet storms, the I can't speak to the quality of the anime you listed, but presumably it's very similar where, you know, like you said, it's budget constrained, it's some minimalist
You're
in
gonna
some
find
capacity.
very polar opinions about it. Very, very polar opinions about it.
Okay.
There are people who really hate anime, and I don't really know why they hate anime. Maybe it's for the same reason I hate a lot of Western animation. You grew up with something and you came into certain expectations or whatever. And
I usually
mean,
just
there's
make
a lot
fun
of
of
anime
it
I just
because
can't
it's
watch. So
I just make fun of it because it's really funny to see the people who staunchly defend it get really upset, but that's like the same thing with anybody. And I'm pretty sure I've seen you do the same thing about anime anyways, if you know that it's going to get a rise.
Well, I mean, look at Motendu. His tagline is "Anime sucks," and that just is just this perfect troll. It gets people so mad. And yet on his server, there's just nonstop talk about anime. So
yeah, I'm sure I've actually seen plenty of content creators who actually make supplemental or analytical content about anime who talk about like why anime is shit, and you'll find is similar to us talking about games. It's not because we hate games that we talk about how much we don't like a certain game or a certain element of many games. It's because we want better games. That's usually why we're complaining about standards, because they're not being met.
People ask me for reviews on anime because I'd mentioned I read a lot of anime, and when I actually like looked at anime, I realized, for one, I don't have any grounds to review animation. I don't have any grounds to review I've watched Western animation, I've watched Eastern animation. I know kind of where they were back when I was young. Like I watched Dragon Ball Z and Reboot and stuff like that, so I kind of understand a lot of stuff. I've watched a lot of the big things like Babylon 5 and so on and so forth. But I'm definitely not nearly as familiar with the practices and stuff. But it's like, I think you really, in all the cases, you really have to focus on certain things. Anime has a big issue going on that you're going to see in a lot of the mainstream stuff, like, for example, Attack on Titan. And I call it the tragedy fetish. And it creates this very, very predictable flow in which certain things are done, which actually make a lot of the anime very comical and hard to take seriously. because they try so hard, and they try really too hard, and yeah, that's why I don't like bring up those, even though they're like the super popular mainstream stuff that's out there right now. For examples, for anime, I would actually consider Attack on Titan, although visually impressive in many respects, to actually be really, really bad anime. And that's probably why a lot of people have super strong responses, is because there's polarities to these things. And I think that treating anything in a strict polarity, regardless of your like personal opinion on it, really can pollute your view a lot. Like, I have a lot against Blizzard, but I was more than willing to jump into Blizzard Dota and look at it from an open mind. You know, I'm really willing to jump into World of Warcraft in this video series and talk about the highs and lows of my experience with it, positive and negative. And, you know, you try to look past your previous experience with it and formulate, because that's what objective is. You know, you can't let your opinions of something or your past experience of something do anything more than formulate a viewpoint from which to analyze it. And I'm not really sure what it is about. I think it's the crowd of anime that really drives people to hate it.
Yeah, it's usually the fandom of anything.
Because
I'm
not familiar with it. I don't socialize, so I don't really know what the fandoms for these things are like. But I've heard a lot of fandoms are really fucking bad.
Yeah, well, at least it's been my experience that regardless of the quality of a product, if it's popular enough to have a fandom in the first place, you're going to get a lot of like negative like feelings or negative impressions just based on interactions with the people who end up being into stuff. Like, what is it? It's Rick and Morty is the show that was all the rage like 2 years ago or something, or a year ago. And
I've heard that show requires a very high IQ to understand.
So that meme spawned from the idea that the show is like the people who are into that show are like self-described geniuses. And that's the people who want to be into
the YouTube skeptics.
So you get people who are like really fucking, you know, I guess they aggressively share their opinion on something in a way that is not constructive, and usually the opinion isn't even founded to begin with. Like, I aggressively share my opinion all the time, but I can back it up if somebody challenges me on it. And
I just sling shit. I don't need to back anything up.
Well, sure, you can also do that. But when these people are trying to be taken seriously while also acting as angsty as possible, it's pretty... And they're obviously self-identifying as part of a group of people who are fans of a particular thing. You're going to get a lot of polarizing experiences out of that. And that has been my own experience with people who are into anime. Very aggressively, almost religiously. People who like to go to the conventions and put on fursuits and whatever else they like to do in their private time. And, you know, that's just... Sure, there's an element of comedy you can take from that, but that was back before I could look past that in my youth. I was immediately turned away from it just based on the crowd that was sort of flocking towards it. And I'm assuming it's pretty similar even over the internet. A lot of people have found a lot of laughs. I've never met a person in my life who's spoken to the quality or lack thereof of Rick and Morty. Actually, I don't think I know anybody who's even watched it in my personal life.
The only thing I know about Rick and Morty is that the guy who allegedly wrote it was the person who was writing for that YouTube Red series they tried to recruit me for, that they were begging for me to save them from, because this guy had convinced them to use StarCraft 2 instead of Unreal, much to their detriment.
That's like everybody I know.
And then I watched a little bit of it on YouTube when he linked it, and the only thing I could think of is, I'm so fucking glad I didn't take that job because of how embarrassingly bad and unfunny it was. If that's indicative of Rick and Morty in itself, then I can say why a lot of people don't like it.
Yeah, well, again, I haven't really seen, like, Necron was taking the piss out of it a year ago, and he hasn't seen an episode either. So it's like people just like to make fun of people's like the fandoms because they know they're going to get a rise. It's very classic, like, trolley sort of tactics, and that's fine. That's totally fine if that's what people want to do. I think that's certainly been my inspiration for like having an anime role on my server that's bright pink, and I just stick anybody with an anime picture on that role because it's funny to me.
Well, that's what Mr. Medeker does, and I fucking love that guy. I love the responses he gives people on Twitter. Ybot and some other people will link me to the occasional Twitter bouts with him, and just how fucking mad people get at him. It's great.
The only familiarity I have with him is when he had a conversation / debate with Destiny, who I don't know if you're familiar with.
Destiny played
StarCraft 2.
Yeah, StarCraft 2.
Now he plays League.
Remember their I don't remember them ever. I mean, I don't really follow Mr. Medicare, so I don't really remember anything like that.
Right, yeah. That's the only time I've ever tuned in anything he did. It was a pretty funny conversation because it was sort of like what you were describing, where slinging shit but not backing anything up. It's like basically exactly what he was doing, where he was like half holding a position, and then his opponent in the ideological ring would come forward and try to attack that position, and Medicare would just be like, I guess we should just talk about something else. It really just fucking pissed this other guy off. That's the only reason
Mr. Medicare to me, the way I was introduced is when he made videos about we was Kangs and Pausies and YouTube skeptics or Reddit skeptics and all these other like pedophiles and shit that were getting on his case because he's a bully over the internet or some shit.
The rise in pedo acceptance is something that we have to make an entire podcast about. Just one of these days, I think like for podcast number 100, we should just have an entire podcast where we talk about liberals. That would be funny.
Liberals are just, they're so strange. Like there's a lot of like liberal concepts that make perfect sense on paper, but then you see what people who are liberals are doing to countries like Canada, and you've got like that Jackie Chan like grappling with his head, just an absolute madness, or the Psyduck image. Like that's your response. It's just like, why would you give these people power? I mean, your alternatives are conservatives, which are equally insane, and Democrats, which just look at fucking America for why you wouldn't want them to have power either. So you don't really have a lot of choice, but it's like, you wonder just how long until these countries just implode into themselves and vanish into just this heap of grinding assholes.
Yeah, which is going to collapse first, the Western civilization or the games industry? That we should have like a running bet.
I think the games industry, I think, is going to collapse. It's going to collapse for eventually, for sure, but it's not going to collapse for a really long time. But you're seeing a lot of you're starting to see now a lot of resistance to shitty business tactics, like what Blizzard is doing. But Blizzard is quite smart. There's one thing they spend a lot of their money on, it's marketing staff who know their shit. Now, I'll probably have to talk about this a later time because it's going to be a long thing. I have to like construct a lot of thoughts on it. But I've been playing these phone games. So one is Puzzle and Dragons and one is Fate Grand Order. And Puzzle and Dragons, I think, is one of the most popular, if not the most popular, phone game you're really going to find. And I have seen descriptions to the extent of it being genius in how it manages to rob money from you. And when I play it, I don't really feel that. I mean, I see all the gacha incentives, but I don't really see, like, the psychological hooks don't work on me because I'm a developer and I know how much time it takes to make content, and I know that it's like a grind bait and stuff like that, and like none of that works on me. So what I'm trying to do right now is trying to understand how the psychological hooks work. And something that Motendu mentioned on his server just yesterday is he was watching gambling streams, and he was watching people use gambling machines, and he was watching the hooks that the gambling machines use. How if you fail, nothing happens. If you win, you get all the lights, you get the fanfare and stuff like that. The ceremony is what Blizzard and Riot calls it, the ceremony. That term is used specifically to refer to things like loot boxes opening the ceremony, the hook for adrenaline rush. And the gaming industry is pulling a lot from Asia. These are Asia things. I believe I discussed PC bangs and pay-per hour internet and some other stuff in the past.
Yeah, it takes like the subscription model and ramps it up pretty heavily.
Yeah, very. So the games, as games, independent of their monetization platforms, I actually don't think they're too bad at all. I'm not a puzzle guy. I think I've made that abundantly clear. I hate fucking puzzles. But I can see the hook for Puzzle and Dragons. I can see the draw for becoming stronger, for improving, for gathering resources to get your next waifu, because that's really one of the major draws for these games is the waifus. I can understand that, and I can see myself playing it, and I do play it. There's a reason why I can stomach doing this, is because the games themselves really aren't too bad. Fate Grand Order is much simpler of a game, at least to actually play. But you get actual story in it. The production value in it is kind of mix and match, but it's actually a lot higher than I was expecting for a phone game. Another one I might play later down the line is Grand Blue Fantasy, which is another waifu hunt game. And like as games, they're really not too bad. But the marketing platform behind them is what this industry is feeding off of. So you know all about the day one DLC, the season passes, all this other shit. That's all basically an Americanized evolution of a very, very similar concept the Asians have been using for quite a while now and have found great success and really, really massive success. And it brings into, again, this risks going into like multi-hour discussion territory because there's a lot of stuff I'm just not really 100% sure in. But a lot of things I don't really understand is like Fate, Grand Order. The American audience is large, but not that big compared to the Japanese audience. So something you see in Japan is how they are trying to get the Western audience. That's why you have stuff like Castlevania getting gutted. That's why you have stuff like Devil May Cry getting gutted. That's why you have Capcom just shitting all over everything. Everything's just getting gutted because Japanese view Americans as basically being brainless window lickers, and in, you know, perfect right sense. But at the same time, America's big, and Japan wants some of that pie. So Japan and Korea and, you know, other countries need to adapt their titles for the American audience. So you probably don't follow MMOs or anything like that, but Korea has a slew of MMOs that then come to the American market and Europe. And what ends up usually happening is the developer hires a company that serves as like their arm in the other country that handles the localization and makes changes to the game for that market. So Terra, for example, which is basically a lowly murder simulator, the Americans who do the localization for that game en masse, I believe they own PUBG now, actually. They're mind-blowingly stupid. They are just the greediest, laziest fucks imaginable. They censored all the lolis. They fucked up all the meshes in the game for all the lolis because they were scared of these characters showing some skin because Americans are prudes. And the way in which they butcher these models is to basically add shorts onto everything. And they're just clipping and just a huge fucking mess. Everything's a disaster. They actually gutted a lot of stuff out of the Korean version, for example, personal shops and stuff, because they just felt that Americans weren't going to use that. And then, you know, like lots of stuff like that. So you go into these phone games, and one of the things I really don't understand about them is, so it's in the best interests of the company behind Fate Grand Order to get a bigger Western audience. There's people in America who like Japanese games, who will play on the Japanese servers even though they don't understand Japanese, because the American version is actually like 2 years behind in content compared to the Japanese version. And content is literally money, because it's fan service, it's unlockables, stuff you can pay for, stuff you can grind for, just stuff, which directly amounts to revenue for phone games, because the phone games thrive off of, for example, power creep, similar to League of Legends, but a more linear model in which things get stronger. We release stronger and stronger units. Power creep is very real. So you want people rolling the loot boxes to get your power creep units, but also the waifus. New waifus get released all the time that people want. But Japan is 2 years ahead. There's just tons of content that doesn't exist in the US version. And I can't even wrap my head around why it's 2 years behind. I can understand like a month or two behind for the process of localization. but the Western version is using Japanese lines with subtitles, so localization I don't think is even really that big of an issue for them at all. So it's just like there's so many things I just don't really understand why they don't like keep things more up to date, especially since they're actually showing they showed the I mentioned Fate Heaven's Feel. It's obviously probably a different branch of the IP entirely, different companies, everything working on it. But that was actually available in the US. I was talking to someone about this a year ago in Japanese and subbed, I think. I don't know if it was dubbed or not. And that was, I think, around the same time it came out in Japan or close to it. So, but the gaming industry, basically, it looks to titles like these and the fact that they have an alleged 40, 50 million players. So think about World of Warcraft. That's an ultra successful game on behalf of it having no investment from the company whatsoever. Blizzard has probably paid less than $1,000 to create World of Warcraft. It's just a hodgepodge of just shit dug up from the basement, puked up by interns and people they probably didn't pay anything for, and then just Metzen's drivel scraped off the bathroom floor. It is a hideous conglomeration of trash. And yet, it is the most successful game at least on the PC, I think, that's ever been created, and remains a industry-leading title to this day. But still, Blizzard's alleged the numbers they claim to have had, I think, peaked around 10 million subscribers. But if you think about these phone games, if you get one whale paying $1,000 to try to get their waifu, and you got 50 million overall players, the numbers that you look at are just like you look at these numbers and you think, wow, the gaming industry has never been bigger. 50, if the numbers are real, 50 million people playing this game, even if only 1 to 2% of those people spend money, and 1 to 2% of those people are whales that spend hundreds to thousands of dollars, and I know someone who does. People do this. I know someone who did this. Spent over $1,000 to get a waifu in Grand Blue Fantasy and couldn't even get him.
JPEGs.
The return of your investment is just, it puts even World of Warcraft to shame. So companies are realizing, wait a second, we can not make a game, Scam Citizen, and random degenerates with access to their dad's credit card will pay $25,000 for a JPEG of a ship for something that isn't even developed, Scam Citizen. They realize you don't need to make a game. I mean, they've known this for years, but back in the day, some people had standards, and some people would actually cry pretty loudly when they realized they were being handed a product that was not even a game. But now today, we have apologists who will defend companies that keep feeding them less and less and less and less, and put in systems that very blatantly abuse the mentally inept, taking advantage of psychological hooks that normally have protections surrounding them in gambling. Now people apologize for that, so now you have a community of people who think this is all right, that is encouraging developers. Final Fantasy XIV, this is an MMO. You pay for the game up front, just like World of Warcraft, and then you pay monthly. People are asking them to put things in the cash shop for them to pay more instead of having them in the game that you can play the fucking game to earn them by playing the game. They'd rather just pay more money up front for that instant gratification. Like, it just, like, why even play the game if you have nothing to work towards? Like, ugh. That's why the industry won't die just yet. The industry for gamers died years ago. You are no longer a part of the audience that these people are developing towards. And as time goes on, more and more and more developers, as it becomes more and more accepted, will push themselves towards assuming that format to the stage where you're going to have to pay to do pretty much anything at all. Because the main driving mechanism that drives currencies and microtransactions in these phone games is the stamina system. The way it baits you is it gets you into the game. It gives you a free roll on the gacha, it's called, which is the loot boxes. And yes, you can just keep making new accounts and keep rolling that free roll until you get a SSR or whatever, a super powerful unit, which is what a lot of people do. But in order to actually play the game consistently, like if I want to play my game and grind it up in the free to play to get my waifus, if I want to do that, you have to space it out because of time gating. You know, daily quests, shit like that, time gating. It's a literal adaptation of this shit from Asia. Time gating. The stamina to play the game, you pay in stamina. You recharge. Now in Fate Grand Order is far less forgiving than in Puzzle and Dragons. But at the same time, the metrics for which you generate the content is really different too. So you pay, say, 8 stamina to advance one mission in the story. In Fate Grand Order, each little segment of the story has like 4 or 5 battles in it, and it's been going up as I'm going through it. And each of those battles costs, let's say, 8 to 10 stamina. My level, you only have about 40-50 stamina. You regenerate 1 stamina every 4 or 5 minutes or something absurd like that. So if you want to get into the game, if you're actually engaged in the story, you want to read the story, you have to wait hours between like 10 minutes of gameplay. Now you're asking, well, what's the catch? You can buy the in-game currency to refill your stamina. That's the hook. First, they get you interested in the gameplay. They say, hey, you can roll for a waifu, you can get into the story, you can get into the gameplay, and just as you get into it, bam, you're hooked into that time gate that says, you want to keep playing? You want to play consistently? You want to enjoy the game? You're either going to be waiting, which most people don't have patience, or you're going to be coughing up money. So it's perfectly reasonable to play these games free to play. You just have to very forcibly segregate your playtime to 10 minutes or so every 4, 5, 6 hours, which is okay for me because I like pick up my tablet when I'm like waiting for fucking, you know, Chrome or Firefox. Like if I'm looking in Roll20 and I'm like trying to because Roll20 only fucking works on one browser. I hate Chrome with all my heart, but I've got to fucking use it for this piece of shit. Because Web 2.0, I have to wait for shit to fucking happen that I shouldn't have to wait for happening. Like uploading a JPEG file. Oh, I can just hop into a fucking mission in Puzzle and Dragons or something. Set aside the tablet when I'm doing other stuff, or what if I'm encoding a video or something like that. But if you actually wanted to, I don't know, play the game as a game, in order to do that, you have to pay money. So, what about today, where it's just an accepted standard that people release $70, $80 season passes of shit yanked out of the game and then thrown into individual DLC, as opposed to expansions. Now, I riff on Blizzard all the fucking time, but there's some things they do right. And that is, they still have expansions, as opposed to nickel and diming you every fucking step of the way, and then having in like $80 DLC. You know, World of Warcraft, for all its many problems, at least when there's an expansion, you get an expansion. StarCraft 2 may be god-awful, but at least you buy an expansion, there is, you know, an extra like 20, 30 missions. They could be drivel or whatever, but it's still far higher than the industry standard in terms of what you get. The industry standard is so fucking low that anybody can accomplish that, but at least Blizzard hasn't quite gotten to that stage until Jock MTG and Overweight. That's when they went downhill. And of course, the Necromancer DLC for Diablo 3 is insane as well.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because it's more expensive than Reaper of Souls, and it's like a fraction of the content, quote unquote.
Yeah. So obviously, like, that's what I mean. Blizzard is adapting to the model that the rest of the industry is finding hyper successful. Blizzard already puts no effort into anything they're doing. They realize they can cut everything up and divide it all up and think, oh, we can get even more money. Even more money. And you can kind of, like, if you follow how Blizzard's been moving things along in terms of how they've been monetizing stuff, you can really see them, like, tasting the waters. The first was the Celestial Steed. I mean, World of Warcraft was an experiment all in itself, but the Celestial Steed, the first cash shop item, was their first, like, real tasting the waters. Just how low can you go? Turns out pretty fucking low. 2 million in one day is the number as I heard. And then Overweight is like the grand experiment with MTG for jocks. Is just, let's have something that's not a game, that is garbage by all stretch of the imagination, but is accessible because it lets everybody succeed. And then you hook that crowd that's been into all this other shit that says you don't need to be a gamer to be a gamer. Now you've got Overweight. Okay. And then you've got Diablo 3, and then you've got StarCraft 2, and all this shit. Very mechanical processes behind it to lower skill expression, to remove skill caps, to drop them down or get rid of the ability to express yourself individually entirely because of comments and mindsets of like those that I showed you before of people saying there is no such thing as a superior player. Like I said, there's this sort of like movement against skill, against challenge. And you've experienced this too with your campaign, is people who are just vehemently opposed to the concept of being challenged in a game. And that's where the industry is going. So is the industry going to die soon? No. The industry for us is dead. The industry for the demi-humans, the unmen, is in full swing. But even then, a lot of casuals are starting to realize they're being had. And there's so much mismanagement going on. Like PUBG is gotta be the most mismanaged shit I have ever fucking seen, to the point they're on this delusional crusade against Epic and all these other companies for stealing their pan, their iconic pan. Like these people are just making fools of themselves left and right. PUBG doesn't perform right on consoles. On the PC, it's a fucking disaster. I don't know how that shit's popular, but people are starting to realize, because of all the companies copy-pasting the whole Battle Royale thing, even like the most mind-numbingly brain-dead apologistic people are realizing this is a pattern, a very intentional, systematic pattern, and it's starting to get those almonds activating, you know. So, you know, give or take 20, 30 years, you might actually start seeing a movement back towards producing quality content.
Well, it all starts with you guys listening. Got to build your worlds right. Got to make sure you're intertwining your gameplay with your story.
You gotta sling some shit.
Oh yeah, and you gotta sling some shit too.
You gotta be like a baboon, man. You gotta have a bright ass, and you gotta sling some shit.
How come baboons are so underrepresented in media? You ever notice that?
I think a lot of people get triggered by their bright asses, actually.
Yeah, I think there was a show called Cow and Baboon or something. It was on when I was a kid. I don't remember.
You know,
Cow and Chicken? I don't know. There was some baboon show on Nickelodeon when I was really young. And it really did scar me for it did scar me for life. So maybe I understand why.
You know, I don't know if it's that show or from Ren and Stimpy, but I think that's actually where the clapping of the buttocks came from. Is one of the shows where a baboon clapped his ass cheeks together. That was like one of the most inspirational things in my entire life. Like, I've never really had idols, except for Beard Maggot from Operation Seawall, but the baboon ass clapping has always stuck with me.
Yes, the show is called I Am Weasel, and it was an American animated television series. Oh, it's Cartoon Network, not Nickelodeon.
Can you imagine a show like that being televised today?
No. There's a IR Baboon was one of the characters, and he had a gigantic red ass, and he would every episode I think he would clap it. So
yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah,
what a trip down memory lane that is.
So when you guys want to build a world, just think of baboons clapping their ass and realize you could be that iconic. You don't have to be super sophisticated about it, but if you got a baboon clapping your ass, you can't do any wrong.
Yeah. Don't do any wrong. Clap your ass. And
clap your ass.
We'll see you on the next week where we talk about something else like ass clapping or Lollies. I don't know.
Lollies.
I'm sure we'll figure something out. Until next time, you liberal scum, you've been had! Go apologize for Blizzard some more! I'm Jay Barino, bye.